Good morning. Welcome to the Fórum Cultural de Alcochete. It's our pleasure to welcome you to the second Portuguese Symposium on Philosophy and Artificial Intelligence, with the theme Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. To the opening session, I welcome first of all Fernando Pinto, Mayor of Alcochete.
Excelentíssimos membros do Comitê Científico, caras e caros participantes, oradores e demais convidados, minhas senhoras e meus senhores, bom dia, welcome. É com enorme gosto que Alcochete acolhe o segundo Simpósio português sobre Filosofia e Inteligência Artificial, subordinado ao tema Ser Humano na Era da Inteligência Artificial. Estes 2 dias de conferência, cuja organização pertence à Câmara Municipal de Alcochete, maiormente através do Gabinete de Inovação, Desenvolvimento Económico e Turismo, assim como pela Alcochete Up, numa extraordinária parceria com a nova IMS, o Centro de Filosofia das Ciências da Universidade de Lisboa, o Instituto da Filosofia das Ciências da Universidade de Lisboa e ainda com o apoio da Associação Portuguesa para a Inteligência Artificial e do LASI. Congratulo-me igualmente, e verdade seja dita, pela estreita e profícua colaboração com as empresas do Concelho de Alcochete e particularmente com o restaurante Omágio, que nos irá acolher no período de almoço, e estou convicto que irão, enfim, ficar bastante satisfeitos com a beleza estética do espaço em questão, mas sobretudo com a gastronomia que nos vão presentear. Às entidades parceiras, e todas e todos, aqueles que projetaram, desenvolveram e tornaram possível este momento que se exige que seja de reflexão, também de debate, deixo antecipadamente o meu mais profundo reconhecimento e agradecimento. Esta é também, já diria, a vossa casa, uma casa que estará sempre de portas abertas para vos receber e, não obstante o facto de ela se apresentar neste tom mais escurecido, é uma casa que está preparada para deixar entrar luz e conhecimento sobre aquilo que somos enquanto seres humanos. No fundo, a realidade que construímos e o cenário em que estamos inseridos no nosso cotidiano. A defesa intransigente daquilo que são as nossas tradições e ADN cultural enquanto comunidade não impede nem colide com aquilo que considero ser de extrema importância, quer como autarca, quer como cidadão, que no fundo é contribuir para ampliar o entendimento acerca da permanente mutação inerente à inteligência artificial e também relacionada com os seus mais diretos mecanismos. Vivemos dias de grande transformação. Alguns dos nossos valores e conceitos parecem ficar fragilizados e, por isso, é de todo necessário criar espaços que contribuam para a sua compreensão. Estamos em mutação permanente no nosso país, na Europa, no mundo, e os desafios que nos são colocados face àquilo que é expectável que aconteça no futuro exige de todas e de todos uma reflexão profunda, uma discussão de ideias para que possamos, de facto, trilhar um caminho melhor para nós, para os nossos filhos, para os nossos netos, enfim, para as gerações vindouras. Dado o gigantesco impacto que a inteligência artificial tem na sociedade, torna-se, de algum modo, impossível separar os aspectos filosóficos e sociais daqueles que, no fundo, são os aspectos económicos, tecnológicos e mesmo, eu diria, do ponto de vista legal e também do ponto de vista político. Pensar qual o lugar do homem nesta nova realidade é muito importante, diria fundamental nos dias de hoje. Acredito que esse lugar estará sempre, de alguma forma, garantido, naturalmente, com a aquisição de novos papéis, novas perspectivas, quiçá até novas relações. O ser humano é e continuará a ser determinante no desenvolvimento deste novo ramo da ciência de computação e, sobretudo, será decisivo enquanto regulador, responsável ético, crítico e pensador. Este tema, ou este conjunto de temas, não se esgotam, mas se durante estes 2 dias de partilha for possível avançar na compreensão e, sobretudo, contribuir para o aparecimento de sinergias entre as diversas áreas da comunidade científica em torno desta temática, eu diria que conseguimos alcançar o objetivo a que todos nos propusemos. Portanto, caras e caros convidados, que nesta que é a nossa Casa da Cultura, nesta que é a nossa Casa do Empreendedorismo, não for ao facto de paredes meias com este auditório termos disponível a nossa incubadora de negócios, a nossa Alcochete Up, que aqui possamos de facto refletir ao longo destes 2 dias de trabalho, que se promova a discussão, que efetivamente exista uma visão dinâmica das reflexões, porque não tenho absolutamente nenhuma dúvida que o futuro se escreve precisamente nos dias de hoje, ou seja, no presente. Resta-me desejar a todas e a todos a continuação de um excelente dia, votos de um trabalho extraordinário e que a minha, hoje, vossa terra, Alcochete, seja inspiradora para os pensamentos humanos que aqui seguramente se irão partilhar. Muito obrigado, bom trabalho, boa estadia para aqueles que aqui ficam na nossa terra de Alcochete. Muito obrigado.
Thank you, Mayor. Now, I now have to give the floor to Ernesto Costa, President of the Scientific Committee.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Scientific Committee of the Second Portuguese Simpósio on Philosophy and AI, I would like to welcome you all. I will give a brief introduction of this event, so just a few words. I'm not as good as the mayor in speaking for such an audience. And so I will start to state the aims, the major aims of this event. We want to bring together 3 communities: computer scientists, philosophers, and neuroscientists, under a general theme that we call being human in the era of AI. I think this discussion we aim to start on the topic could not be more timely and necessary. It is timely because recent developments of AI, particularly thanks to deep learning algorithms, have sought to solve Hans Moravec's paradox. In fact, computers were capable of solving highly complex problems, could be mathematical problems, cognitive problems, but failed at tasks that were essentially simple, such as those involving perception or interaction in natural language, tasks that a young child could solve at an early age. And so, if we look to the results of today, like autonomous vehicles or large language models like ChatGPT, we have the tendency to think that we have solved Hans Moravec's paradox, but this must be addressed today here and tomorrow too, I guess. And so it's timely for that reason, but it's also necessary, because beyond technical issues, such as the design of the architectures, the high energy consumption of deep learning machines, or the lack of explainability of results, there are complex problems related to ethics, moral, law, and politics that yet have to be solved. And again, I hope that during these 2 days, all of us will try not solve all these issues, but at least raise the right questions in order to, in the years to come, we can approach the solutions. So, as I was saying, this symposium does not intend to address all these issues. It is focused on discussing the potential impact of some aspects of AI, particularly machine learning, on people and society. We seek to understand to what extent machines are qualitatively changing, ceasing to be mere tools and becoming autonomous agents, and how this may affect, again, us as individuals and as a society. It is possible to have agents which are not the product of a biologic evolutionary process, but were designed by us and in the end be better than us. This is the question. And of course, as I already said, I don't think we are capable of solving these issues, but at least having put the right questions, we'll be approaching the solution for these problems. Now a few words about the organization. The event is organized with keynote presentations. We have the first one in a few moments, and some discussion panels, some roundtables, and also some poster presentation, invited poster presentations. I think all these three things will enrich our discussions, and I hope that during coffee breaks and all these lazy moments, we continue the discussion that we are going to start here. So we sincerely hope to foster a debate that extends beyond the symposium. If we imagine to engage the stakeholders like lay people, scientists, businessmen, professional organizations, and governments in an open debate on these issues, we have met the challenge we set for ourselves. Now, to end, I said in the beginning, I'm not as good as the mayor, so just small few words about acknowledgements. I think some people deserve the expression of our gratitude to all the entities that support and made the event possible. They were already mentioned. The Associate Laboratory of Intelligence System, LASI, the Portuguese Association for Artificial Intelligence, APIA, and Omagio. But also, most important, the organization involved people from different entities to whom we also want to express our gratitude. Nova Information Management School, Nova IMS, Nova Institute of Philosophy, the Center for Philosophy and of Science at the University of Lisbon, and the Alcochete City Council. A very, very special thanks to the Alcochete City Council, special to its president, Fernando Pinto, and his team for their enthusiastic support from day one, maybe from day minus something. Without their help, this event would not exist, and this is a true fact. This is not a philosophical debate on that issue. Without their help, this event would not exist. It is heartening to think that there are still people and public entities facing numerous problems and with limited resources, but who are still able to selflessly support science and its dreams. So our sincere thank you, Mr. Mayor. As I mentioned, I'm here speaking on behalf of the event's scientific committee, due to the last-minute health issue preventing Professor Elder Coelho from attending. However, I would like to end with one last, perhaps unusual thank you that I cannot overlook. To the person who had the vision and the energy to organize this symposium and made it a reality, who dedicate body and soul to the project, Professor Vitor Santos, I'm sure, eternal thanks. And now, let's the games begin. Thank you.
Before the games begin, I'd like to invite to the stage Robert Clovis from the School of Social Sciences and Humanities of Nova Lisbon.
Good morning. actually, some of the themes I was going to discuss, or just briefly mention, actually, because I only have a few minutes, have already been mentioned. I think an important thing that we're doing here today is bringing together different communities with sort of relevant interests to talk about artificial intelligence. And as Ernesto Costa has already said, we're at a kind of dramatic moment in a way. And I think it's worth saying that I'm a philosopher of mind and technology, which is hitherto a kind of a weird conjunction for many people. But now it's becoming increasingly apparent why we need people to work on mind and technology, because these apparently distant categories are overlapping more and more and causing us to have to ask and answer questions. It was only a few years ago that nobody had even heard of large language models, nobody outside, a very technical community. But the sort of revolutionary impact that they've had, not just in what artificial intelligence can do, but our sense of what artificial intelligence might do. And I think very importantly, sometimes this is downplayed, but our sense of ourselves, what kinds of beings are, because I think this is certainly true of philosophers, mind scientists, people who work on mind and cognition. But I think it's largely true. I mean, people in the field will tell me if I'm wrong about this in artificial intelligence, that we didn't really expect this technology to do what it's done. People had been sort of trailing for a long time. It might do something dramatic, but it seemed to happen so quickly that it's doing so much. And so this is important. I'm writing a book about large language models and how that relates to the mind at the moment. The first chapter is called The Miracle of Large Language Models. And this is not because it's a sort of religious intervention, obviously, or anything like that. But it's because we just didn't expect this technology to do what it's doing coming from this direction. And so what this forces is, I think we have to ask some very difficult questions, to really ask ourselves questions as well. Did we really understand the mind or understand many other categories correctly in the first place? And it was put to me over dinner last night when we were sort of talking about what should be said at the introduction, that one thing that's already been mentioned is we're trying to bring different communities together to talk about these very serious issues. And there's a story about the elephant. People, three people go into a dark room and there's an elephant in the room and they try to work out by touching this huge beast what it is they're looking, what it is they're feeling or experiencing. And one person says, oh, it's like a snake. And of course they're holding the trunk. And another person, oh, it's like a tree trunk, because they've probably got their arms around another massive leg. And somebody says, oh, it's like a coconut. And we probably shouldn't talk any more about that. But and there is this question with this generative AI. There's so many different perspectives that come to it and try to understand it and try to grasp it. And indeed, I think the program that we've tried to put together tries to look at this new artificial intelligence from lots of different directions and ask some of the deep questions. And I thought, there is one question that people might ask is, what do philosophers bring to the table on this? And this is something I can talk about a little bit. And I think if philosophers bring anything to the table here, it's asking really hard questions, right? That's kind of, and asking uncomfortable questions sometimes as well, and asking the questions that perhaps people don't even really want to hear. And so the old tradition of philosophy, as you know, our tradition of philosophy in many ways begins with Socrates, who asked so many hard questions that he was eventually put to death by the Athenian state. So I think it's important. Nobody gets put to death today, of course. But I think it's important that we try and keep open a space where we can ask some hard questions. And that's very much what this meeting is about. And so the other thing I'm here to do today, I think is why I was nominated to do this, is because I'm here to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Keith Frankish, who is a fantastic philosopher. Of course, it will be embarrassing for me to say all these, for him to say all these things I'm going to say about him, but I really think he's, one of the most important philosophers in the world at the moment, who thinks about mind, who thinks about consciousness, as we'll come on to, and has something really important to say about these themes. And it's also, since we're in this moment of large language models and generative AI, is sort of deeply engaged with what the new technology might tell us about the mind. So he's nearly the perfect person that we could have today to open our meeting. And just to tell you a few things about Keith, he's honorary professor of philosophy at Sheffield University. He's also based in University of Crete, is that right? Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was called that. In Crete at the moment, he has various other honorary positions. Something I've been introducing Keith at another meeting recently, I think this might be more important for us, but he edits this, amazing series called Elements of Mind for Cambridge University Press. And it produces short publications which the general public could read, but also they make important philosophical contributions, short books. And when they're published, they're online for a couple of weeks for free at the beginning. I really think this is going to create something new for the future, a new understanding of philosophy of mind. And we are at a moment which is of vital importance. So, hard questions. One thing I can tell you about Keith, which I'm sure will touch on in this talk, is he is, the greatest living proponent, perhaps I can say, of a view called illusionism, which is to say human consciousness, is not what we take it to be. I won't go into any more detail on this, but human consciousness is not what we take it to be. And so this is very pertinent at this moment, because we live in a moment where these machines that we've very recently built are doing a whole bunch of stuff that seems to be, if you didn't know any better, if you didn't know how they were doing it, you might think they were indeed conscious. And maybe they even are. I mean, this is a question which I'm not going to offer an opinion on. I have an opinion. But so we need to think harder about these questions about mind and about consciousness and what kind of mental properties these new systems can instantiate. And so I think I will not go into any further on this because Keith can say much better things about this than I can say. And so with that, perhaps, I think I can introduce you, Keith. So now we have the next session with Keith Frankish, that maybe we could change the slide. And it will, because I can't remember what the name of the talk was, but it's something to do with consciousness. Please. Okay.
Olá, pessoal. I've now reached the limits of my Portuguese. Oh, I have one more word which I will use at the end. Thank you so much to Vitor, Ernesto, Rob, all the other members of the scientific committee for inviting me. It's an honor to be here and an honor to give the opening talk. And thank you to Rob for that introduction. I'm not sure it was deserved, but I'm very grateful for it. This picture here is the cover image from a book that I edited with the American philosopher Bill Ramsey. It appeared 10 years ago, and it was called The Cambridge Handbook to Artificial Intelligence. Contained a series of essays summarizing the different aspects of work in artificial intelligence. It's, looking at it now, it's dated. A lot has changed in the last 10 years. But one thing that hasn't changed, I think, is the sophistication of our thinking about consciousness. I don't think the philosophers are keeping up. In fact, and this is a rather provocative thing to say in some ways, I think we might be going backwards. I want to try to update our thinking about consciousness so that it can catch up with the work that computer scientists and roboticists and neuroscientists are doing. But first, I want to say a word about someone who's is, in a sense, present here, but unfortunately not physically present or capable of being physically present, and that is Daniel Dennett. Rob very kindly described me as one of the leading proponents of the illusionist view of consciousness. He wouldn't have been able to do that with any plausibility at all while Dan was still alive. Dan died in April this year. He was my in many ways my mentor. I didn't have an official, he was never my official supervisor, or I didn't actually work with him in a formal capacity, but he was my mentor. He was my inspiration, he was my intellectual hero, and I'm also proud to say that he was my friend. And his loss, his sudden death in April, has deprived us, I think, of one of the leading intellectual lights of our age. I think by the end of this century, when people look back, they will see that when it comes to the big issues of consciousness, free will, meaning, the self, Dan basically got it right. I think we need to play catch up with Dan. And why is there a picture of cranes here? Well, that's a picture I took yesterday walking in Lisbon. I saw a lot of cranes in Lisbon. And if you know Dan's work, you'll know that he liked to draw a comparison between sky hooks and cranes. A sky hook is something that sort of just floats in the air, but you can hang things from it, and it can lift things up with it, but it just floats in the air. There's no explanation of how it gets there, how it does its work. A crane, of course, is something that you can do the same with, that you can hang things from and lift things with, but you can see how it works. Understand how it does it, understand the mechanism. And Dan liked to use that analogy in various areas of philosophy, for a contrast between unexplained explainers, things that people posit to explain something, but then don't explain the thing itself. So an intelligent designer would be an example of that. You can use an intelligent designer to explain the presence of design in the world, but if you don't explain the designer themselves, then you've just got a sky hook. It's convenient to explain these things, but you don't explain it. You need cranes, not sky hooks, and of course, in the case of design in nature, evolution is the crane. So Dan would have liked to see all the cranes in Lisbon. And right up until the end of his life, I mean, he's still working vigorously, Dan was very concerned about what is happening in artificial intelligence at the moment, and particularly the social impact of large language models and other forms of generative AI. And so I wanted to just begin by I'm not going to talk about this, but I wanted to just repeat his warning because I think it's salutary and we should all bear it in mind all the time. Creating counterfeit digital people risks destroying our civilization. He really believed that. And I think he was right. Democracy depends on the informed, not on misinformed, consent of the governed. By allowing the most economically and politically powerful people, corporations and governments, to control our attention, our most important resource, our attention. These systems will control us. Counterfeit people, by which he meant simulations of humans, the sort that, although we were talking about replica, the artificial friend, powered by a large language model. Counterfeit people by distracting and confusing us and by exploiting our most irresistible fears and anxieties will lead us into temptation and from there into acquiescing to our own subjugation. The counterfeit people will talk us into adopting policies and convictions that will make us vulnerable to still more manipulation. Or we will simply turn off our attention and become passive and ignorant pawns. This is a terrifying prospect. I think it's a rather somber note on which to begin, but I think it's something that we should keep in mind throughout this event, and indeed throughout our lives. Okay, so that's Dan. That's my little tribute to Dan. He's no longer with us, but his intellectual influence will live on through his work and through his influence on so many generations of students and colleagues. Okay, now, my title was How to Think About Artificial Consciousness. And I'm going to do this in 4 parts. I'm going to tell you how not to think about it, and that will take up the first 2 parts of the talk, and then I will tell you how to think about it. And it will be a rather provocative talk, And, thank you. And you may be a little shocked, perhaps, by the conclusion, but I don't think it's as shocking as it might seem once you get used to it. It might be shocking in the way that, say, 100 years ago, someone declaring that the soul didn't exist would be shocking, or that a vital spirit that animates living things didn't exist. I'm going to say roughly the same about consciousness. I'm going to begin, let me just begin by saying some things that I take to be uncontroversial. I mean, there isn't much about consciousness that is uncontroversial. You'll find philosophers who will say that electrons are conscious. You seriously will find philosophers who will say that electrons are conscious. You'll find philosophers who will say that only humans are conscious. You will find philosophers who will say that the entire universe is conscious. Serious philosophers who argue these views with rigor and care. They're I'm trying to think of a delicate word. Not fringe people. You'll find these views in mainstream philosophy journals. And so from atoms, from electrons or quarks to the entire universe and just about everything in between, people will say is conscious. But there are some things, I think, that are uncontroversial about consciousness. So that's a good place to start. Okay, so when you attend to something perceptually, you have a conscious experience. So if you attend, if this person here attends to this apple, they will have a conscious experience of it. Normally, other things being equal, if everything's working right. And when you have a conscious experience, your perceptual systems provide you with information about the world. That's what they're for. Okay. That's why evolution equipped us with these things to tell us about the world. And your brain uses this information. This information is made available to a wide range of control systems within the brain and generates a host of reactions. By reactions, I don't just mean behavior, I mean physiological reactions, changes perhaps in hormone level, blood pressure, all sorts of things. Psychological reactions across the whole spectrum of psychological faculties, emotional changes, changes to what you believe, actions may be initiated or at least primed. You may become ready to perform a certain action. You may anticipate a certain performing a certain action. You may form anticipations of what you will perceive next. Associations may be triggered. It may call up memories. All sorts of psychological changes, a huge array of them, not all conscious. Basically, your brain will readjust itself to deal with a world in which there's an apple present there, if they're looking at an apple. And of course, behavioral ones. If you're hungry, you may reach out and grab the apple. Now, what did I do there? Now, that's it. Okay, back. Also, when you have a conscious experience, you can usually tell that you're having it. If somebody says, can you see that apple? You say, yes, I can see that apple. I'm aware that I'm seeing it. Okay. And you can describe your conscious experiences. You can say, oh, that apple tasted very nice. Yes, I enjoyed that. The experience of eating the apple was nice. And you can compare them and say, it wasn't as nice as that other apple I tasted yesterday. That was even better. But it was certainly better than the one I had the day before. You can compare your experiences. Now, sometimes your senses provide you with information about the world without you having a corresponding conscious experience. This is what we call subliminal perception. Our perceptual systems are constantly absorbing information about the world, and sometimes using it to make minor adjustments. Think about walking down the street. Your visual system is taking in information about the position of other people around you and obstacles and so on. But you might be having a conversation and not really noticing any of this consciously. But your brain is guiding you along, doing a good job. You're sort of on autopilot, like a self-driving car maybe, while your conscious mind is occupied with something else. And if you were asked to say, what was the color of the coat of the lady who just passed you, you might be completely unable to say much. I didn't even notice there was a lady who passed me. But you didn't walk into her, so you must have noticed her in some way. At some level, your brain must have taken in that information. So we could say that consciousness is whatever makes the difference between attentive perception, where you're you notice the lady and you look at her coat and remark that it's red. And subliminal perception, where your perceptual system is just taking the information, make a bit of use of it, and then let it go. And it's sometimes said that it's like something to have a conscious experience. This is a phrase popularized by the philosopher Thomas Nagel, that to have a conscious, what's distinctive of conscious experiences is that it's like something to have them. That's a phrase that is quite catchy in English. That really seems to resonate with English speakers. I don't think it works so well in all other languages. I'm not sure how it would work in Portuguese. But many philosophers think that that sort of gives you the essence of consciousness, that it's like something. It seems to me just a piece of hand waving, a bit of little phrase that people latch on to and think, yeah, that sort of gets it. But try to cash it out. What do you get? I don't know. Well, here's one thing you might get. Here's a certain view of what this difference is between conscious and unconscious perception, between subliminal perception and attentive perception. This is one view. Let me just... It's that consciousness, conscious perception, involves the presence of felt qualities. I'll explain this in a minute. It involves an inner world being created, a world consisting of the feel, the subjective feel of experience, the feel of what it's like to see the apple, or taste the apple, or see the woman's coat. And this feel is somehow distinct from all the things I mentioned before, the getting of information about the world, using that information to modulate physiological, psychological, and behavioral processes. It's something else. The brain's doing all that, but somehow in consciousness there is this extra thing, this quality of the experience, this immediately known feel of the experience. It's hard to explain this without gesturing, without talking about what it's like. So there's the information about the apple. Very rich pattern of information. There's the reactions, a very rich pattern of reactions. But there's also something else. There's this mental quality to the experience. And here's a passage from David Chalmers, who's certainly the most famous living proponent of this view, that this is what consciousness consists in. He says, when we think and perceive, there is a whir of information processing. But there is also a subjective aspect. The information processing, of course, isn't essentially subjective. A neuroscientist could, in principle, tell you all about it. There's something subjective that the neuroscientist can't discover. There is something it is like, in Thomas Nagel's phrase there, something it is like to be a conscious organism. When we see, for example, we experience visual sensations, the felt quality of redness, the experience of dark and light, the quality of depth in a visual field. Now, there's obviously something that's right about that. I mean, when he says that, we kind of know what he means. But I think it's often construed in the wrong way, and I think Chalmers and other people who are called phenomenal realists, I'll explain the term in a moment, are misconstruing it. So there's supposed to be this inner world, this mental world, this private world of qualities, the qualities of seeing the colours, hearing sounds, feeling textures, having pains and so on. And these are qualities of mental states or of brain states, not of the objects perceived. The felt quality of seeing the apple, the redness that is felt, is supposed to be a property of your brain or of your mind, not of the apple. It's very important. And this property is often said to be intrinsic in the sense that it's not, you can't capture it in terms of patterns of cause and effect in the brain, in terms of what the brain is doing. It's a matter of what it feels like to be in that state of the brain doing these things. It's intrinsic, it's not definable in terms of functions that the brain is performing. So no account of what the brain does will explain this field. It's said to be irreducibly subjective. That means it can't be detected by anyone else, not directly. I could tell you about it or try to, but you could never detect it, and you could never develop a machine that could detect it because it's essentially subjective. Only I, the subject, am acquainted with it. It's an inner world that is private to me. And because of that, we can't know what other people's mental qualities are like. Maybe the mental quality that you have when you look at an apple. We all agree that the apple is what we call red, that the apple is red. But the mental quality that we have when we see that apple, when we experience it, could be very different in each of us. Maybe in me, it's what the quality that I experience when I look at what we all agree is a red apple. Maybe the quality that I have is like the quality that you have when you look at the sky, the clear sky. It's essentially private, irreducibly subjective, so we can't tell. And there's no way of inferring it from facts about the brain. And it's also said to be immediately and certainly known. You can't be wrong about this. You could be wrong about there being an apple there. You could be wrong about what color the apple is, but you couldn't be wrong about the mental quality that you're having when you see the apple. That's certainly known. This private mental world is known to you much better than the external world. In fact, some people who are idealists think that that's all there is, this mental world, and that the outer world is just an inference from it. Now, various terms are used for these supposed mental qualities. Qualia, which means what it's like. Qualis, what is like. It's a Latin term. So qualia, the what it's like, the what its likenesses. Phenomenal properties is another term that has come to be widely used. Again, what it is like-nesses. So Hegel introduced the phrase what it's like to have a conscious experience. Or we talk about the what it's like-ness of the experience. So I'll use the term phenomenal properties because it's a useful one and quite widely used. And alongside that, we can talk about phenomenal consciousness, which is consciousness understood in this way. Okay, so phenomenal consciousness understood as being constituted by this private inner world of mental qualities. And I will also use the term phenomenal realism for people who believe that phenomenal consciousness is real, who believe that consciousness, in the uncontroversial sense that I started with, is in fact phenomenal consciousness. They understand consciousness that way. You may think, well, what other way is there of understanding it? I will tell you shortly. Okay, now, so this is something like the picture that phenomenal realists have. They will tell you that they don't have this, but they do. And this is, again, I'm going back to Dennett here, to Dan. It's a term he introduced in his 1991 book, Consciousness Explained. He talks about the Cartesian theatre. Cartesian referring to Descartes, who thought that there was a soul, that the brain communicated with a soul, and the soul was the seat of the intelligent thought and consciousness. So Dan said, well, look, people who take this view, who think of consciousness in this way, they're supposing that there is something like a mental theatre, a mental version of this here, with three elements. Sorry, that little quote there from Dan there. Phenomenal realism, he said, assumes, well, phenomenal realism is my word, phenomenal realism assumes a Cartesian theatre, a place where it all comes together, all the processing from all the different sensory systems is assembled together. So you look at the apple and you see its color, and maybe you taste the apple. We only have visual aspects of the apple, I suppose. Maybe you feel the apple, or maybe you're looking at something that's also making a noise. And all of this information, well, information about the different visual aspects of the apple, the size, the shape, the color, the distance, all of this is assembled into a coherent multimodal conscious experience made out of these qualities, out of these qualia. And Dan points out that phenomenal realism assumes that there is a place in the brain where this is all assembled and made available, presented to the self in conscious experience. So this picture requires three elements: a show of phenomenal properties. All the sense organs do all their processing, they assemble all the information, and then somehow create out of that this mental world, this mental multimodal. You notice there are speakers here as well in this. No? Yeah, never mind. There are speakers there as well, and there will be smell, things emitting smells and so on. And then you have a subject who is watching the show, observing the show, acquainted with the show. Now, what this subject is somewhat mysterious. In the Cartesian picture, in Descartes' picture, of course, it would have been an immaterial soul. A lot of people who are phenomenal realists don't believe in the soul anymore. So it's not clear exactly what's standing in for the soul here. Some sort of subject. Can't really be another part of the brain. You can't have the brain watching this show. Surely it's got to be something a bit more like a self than just a bit of the brain. And an epistemic relation, a knowledge relation between the subject and this show. Okay. This is the relation I talked about earlier that is especially certain. You know what's happening in your Cartesian theatre, for sure, for certain, even if you're not sure what's happening in the outer world. There's definitely an apple being presented there in the Cartesian theatre, even if there might not actually be an apple there in front of you. And this relation to your phenomenal properties, to your qualia, is quite unlike the relation to the worldly properties that are perceived. That is more indirect. You could be hallucinating, you could be dreaming, the lighting conditions could be deceiving you about the color. It could be a hologram and so on. So you can't be sure there's an apple there, but you can be sure there's a mental image of an apple in your Cartesian theatre. Now, I think if there may be some phenomenal realists here, and certainly if there were, they would say, no, I don't really see it like that. I don't want to commit myself to this, because that sounds a bit mad. This inner show. But I think, Dan thought, and I think that they are still implicitly committed to something like this, because what else could these mental qualities, these phenomenal properties, these qualia be, if not something like that? What else could it be? You tell me. If by hypothesis, they are mental qualities, so there's something like a show. There has to be something like an observer of that show. If the mental qualities are not being detected and reacted to in some way, then what's the point of them? And how on earth do they matter to me? And if this relation isn't specially direct, then how can I be sure it's there? So I think they are committed to something like this. I can say a lot more about this. And as Dan says, the persuasive imagery of the Cartesian theatre keeps coming back to haunt us, lay people and scientists alike. I've got a lot to say, and I'm still not through the first part, so I maybe try to speed up a little bit. Now, here's the question. Suppose you buy that view and you say, yeah, okay, that's what I think consciousness is, something kind of like that, along those lines. So, could we create a phenomenally conscious robot, a robot that has that sort of inner world? Well, there are lots of problems in doing that. First of all, how would you design it? How would you create a blueprint for a machine that had that sort of inner world? To design a machine, we need, to put it very, very simply, we need to provide some sort of description of what we want the machine to do, the functions we want it to perform. We have to have some idea, at least an outline of what we want the thing to do. And then we need to build mechanisms that do it, that perform the relevant function. Of course, you will split this down into many, many sub-functions, perhaps organized hierarchically. But at each stage, you've got to say, well, what do we want it to do now, and how do we make something that does that. That's essentially how you engineer things, I take it. How you design things, I mean. And we have a rough idea how to do that with many mental capacities, such as perception. You want the thing to detect properties in the world. You want to have some, say if it's a visual perception you want to make, to design, then you need some sort of light-sensitive array, and you need to have some processing that's done on the outputs of that array that classifies different kinds of features like lines and shapes and colors and so on. So you've got some idea of what you want it to do. You want it to extract visual information from the world. Similarly with memory, you want it to store information and retrieve it at appropriate moments. Reasoning, you want it to, I guess, instantiate certain valid forms of inference, which you could represent symbolically, perhaps, in other ways. Got an idea, at least, of how to do it. I'm not saying it's easy. But phenomenal consciousness is totally different. Phenomenal properties can't be characterized in terms of their function. It's not a matter of the brain doing something, it's a matter of it feeling like something intrinsically to be in that state, to be in whatever conscious state you're in. It's not a matter of information being gathered and used and producing reactions. It's a matter of the essential inner feel of the thing. And that can't be characterized in terms of causes and effects, in terms of functions. That's crucial to the definition of what a phenomenal property is, what a felt quality is, and it therefore means that you can't possibly design a system to have these things. Phenomenal properties just intrinsically feel a certain way to the subject. And this is something that most phenomenal realists readily embrace, that we can imagine a zombie whose brain performs all of the functions that ours perform. It has sensory systems that receive exactly the same information that ours do, exactly sensitive as ours, that process that information the same way. The brains produce exactly the same range of reactions that ours do, but it doesn't have this inner world. It doesn't have phenomenal properties. It could be an atom-for-atom duplicate of my brain that could be standing here saying exactly the same things, reacting in exactly the same way, but with the lights off in the Cartesian theater. Now, if that is conceivable, and most phenomenal realists think it is, then of course you can't design something, some brain system to bring the lights on, because those brain systems could exist in a zombie without the lights on, without the Cartesian theory. So if we cannot characterize consciousness in functional terms, then we cannot design a machine to produce it. David Chalmers talks of the hard problem of explaining phenomenal consciousness in terms of what the brain does. The flip side of that is that there's a hard project of creating a machine that has phenomenal consciousness. And by hard here, he means something that essentially can't be done by appealing to mechanisms of any sort. And hard here essentially means impossible, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so you might say, well, okay, we can't design it, but maybe we could at least replicate it. If we can't design it from scratch, we could we could identify the brain systems that produce consciousness in us, what's sometimes called the neural correlates of consciousness, the NCC, the bits of the brain that are essential to producing consciousness, producing this inner show, and then just replicate those bits. And then we still wouldn't know how they did it, but we know that they do it in us, so if we replicate them, then they'll probably do it in the artificial system we've created with a replica of those bits, of the neural correlates. Right, but this again isn't going to work. How would we identify the neural correlates of phenomenal consciousness? We can't detect those properties in anyone else. We can't do an experiment where we say, look, here's what's happening in the brain, and here are the phenomenal properties that are being displayed in the Cartesian theater, and we see that whenever this kind of property is displayed in the Cartesian theater, there's that kind of brain activity, and whenever this other property is displayed, say color, whenever a red color is displayed there, there's this kind of brain activity. Whenever this green is displayed there, there's this kind of brain activity. Whenever a certain sound is played there in the auditorium, Cartesian auditorium, there's this activity. We can't do that because we've no access at all to this. That's private. The best we can do is to map correlations between brain regions and reactions that we can observe, that we take to be indications of what's happening in the Cartesian theatre. We can't identify the neural correlates of consciousness. We can only identify the neural, I should have said that, sorry. One way we could do this one experimental procedure we could use to do this is to disrupt various brain regions with extracranial magnetic stimulation, for example, which harmlessly disrupts activity in a certain region of the brain, and see what effects it has on the subject's consciousness. So if you disrupt this region, maybe they no longer report any visual, conscious visual experiences. But still, you're not actually observing what happens in the Cartesian theatre when you disrupt that bit of the brain. You're observing how the person reacts, what they say. So maybe they say, oh, I no longer see anything. I no longer have any conscious visual experience. And we take that to be a reliable indication of what's happening in the Cartesian theatre. But that just assumes a correlation between behavior and consciousness. And remember, the zombie will say exactly the same, because its behavior is exactly the same as a regular person's. It's an exact functional duplicate of them. Its brain works in the same way, produces the same responses. It's just that the lights are off in the theatre. So it would still say exactly the same as a regular person when you disrupted this brain region. Because the reports that it produces are a consequence of what the brain is doing, not a consequence of what's happening in the Cartesian theatre. So maybe when we're disrupting regions of the brain and producing these effects on the behavior of the person, we're just disrupting the mechanisms that produce those responses. So perhaps we show a subject a stimulus, and we say, can you see that? And they say, yes, I can see a yellow patch. We disrupt a certain region of the visual cortex, and they say, oh, now I can't see it. Now, we infer, oh, we've switched off the lights in the Cartesian theatre. No, maybe we've just switched off their ability to report the stimulus. We can't tell which it is. And indeed, since exactly the same effect would occur in a zombie who doesn't have a Cartesian theatre, the first hypothesis seems more reasonable, that we're just disrupting the mechanisms involved. And indeed, even in the first-person case, we can't be sure. Suppose right now you disrupt a region of my brain and say, what happened when we did that? And I say, oh, I no longer could see anything consciously. They say, right, so the lights went out in your Cartesian theatre. And I say, yes, that's what happened, the lights went out. And then somebody says, well, hang on, how do you know the lights went out? Maybe they stayed on, but you could no longer remember that they were on when we asked you. I don't know. Maybe the lights are off now, but I still think they're on. Maybe when they seemed to go off, they stayed on, but I just became unable to recall that they were on and report it to you. We can never penetrate into the Cartesian theatre to establish what's really happening there, and even the subject themselves can't, because they're dependent on memory and their ability to report to themselves. You might say, well, at every passing millisecond they're aware of what's happening there, maybe. But as soon as they try to report it or react to it, then they're relying on systems of memory, and they might be fallible. No one can get into the Cartesian theatre, and you can't really be sure you've got into it yourself. Anyway, well, let's suppose that even that problem that we set aside and that we can identify the neural correlates of consciousness, we'd still have a problem. At what level of detail would we have to replicate those brains? Suppose we could say, okay, that's the bit that's doing it, that's switching on the lights in the theatre. What level of detail would we have to replicate them? Would it be sufficient to build a replica that performed the same functions, that did the same work in information processing terms that that bit of the brain did, or producing the same reactions that that bit of the brain did? But we could build it out of completely different materials. Or would we have to produce, and perhaps we could use different mechanisms to produce those same effects. We don't have to use exactly the same mechanisms that the brain uses to produce those effects, to perform those functions. Or should we make sure that we replicate those functions using the same mechanisms the brain uses? Okay, so the mechanisms we use to replicate the functions are basically the same as the ones that the brain uses, but maybe made out of different materials, so maybe made out of silicon rather than carbon-based molecules. Or would we need to produce a replica that performs the same functions by means of the same mechanisms, and that is made out of the same biological materials? So essentially we have to replicate precisely that piece of neural tissue, that complex of neural tissue. We've no idea, because we don't know how the neural correlates create consciousness. There's no way of getting from the brain is doing this by means of these mechanisms, using these materials, to there's an intrinsic feel to it all that is not there in a zombie who has the same brain mechanism, has the same brain structures performing the same functions, used by the same mechanisms, using the same materials. So since we don't know how the neural correlates of consciousness create consciousness, we don't know which aspects of them are the crucial ones to replicate. And indeed, there are many different theories as to which it might be, as to how, what sort of correlation we should be looking for at what level. And they're all philosophical theories. They're all a priori, and there's no way of testing them empirically. I'm going to have to speed up a bit. Sorry. I'm about halfway through, but I'll move a little more quickly. Indeed, some say that you don't even need a brain to create consciousness. Some people, as I said, think that electrons are consciousness, that the entire universe might be conscious. So long as you conceive of consciousness as something that is not in any way connected to function, then you could suppose that anything has it. You could suppose that this lectern has it. It's not doing anything, it's not producing any responses that we associate with consciousness, but maybe intrinsically it's like something to be it. Who knows? Once you conceive of consciousness in that way, it's open. Finally, how do we tell if we've succeeded? We can't detect phenomenal properties directly. There's no conceptual link. We can't infer the presence of phenomenal properties from the things we can detect, the internal structures. We could create a robot that displays all the reactions that we associate with consciousness, including all the physiological reactions, psychological reactions, but still isn't conscious. So it will say it's conscious, it will believe it's conscious, it will even perhaps claim that it has a Cartesian theatre. That's how it reacts to its own internal processing when it thinks about it. That it has a Cartesian theatre, that it has these mysterious phenomenal properties, but maybe it's just a zombie. We couldn't really be sure that it has the inner lights are on. That's those of you who know Star Trek will know who that is and why I've put a picture of him there. Okay, so let's, finally, sorry. Suppose we could create phenomenal properties. What would be the point of it? Imagine something like this happens. We have an artificial eye that detects light rays, and there's a transduction of the outputs of that artificial eye into patterns of electronic activity within the brain of our, let's say, our robot. And then we manage to get that electronic activity somehow to produce phenomenal properties, to produce an inner world of mental qualities, produce a show in the Cartesian theatre. Okay, great. What would happen then? What effects would the phenomenal properties have on the rest of the system? And that ended up called the hard question. Actually, he used the term before Chalmers coined the term the hard problem, but it is in a way the counter to the hard problem. Suppose this stuff does exist. What does it do? Here's Dan. Then what happens? Once you have the show in the theatre, you have these phenomenal qualities. If you want a whole theory of consciousness, this is the question you must ask and answer before you have delivered, after you have delivered some item to consciousness. So there's all this sensory processing, it all comes together, there's this conscious experience, and then what happens? It's rendered in this phenomenal medium, and then what happens? If instead you just stop there and say, okay, we've created consciousness, great, wonderful, and declare victory, you have burdened the self or the subject, the observer, the spectator in the Cartesian theatre. You've burdened that with the task of somehow reacting to what's presented there and of doing something with the delivery. And you've left that task completely unanalyzed. It's a sky hook. I mean, we started with the subject looking at an apple. And we thought, how do we understand what's happening there, and how perhaps could we artificially replicate what's happening there with this person looking at an apple. Now we've just replicated the problem internally. We've got some internal self looking at a phenomenal image of an apple, and we've now got to start explaining how it reacts to it. I mean, does the self have internal sense organs that sense the properties of the phenomenal show? What happens? If you just stop there and say, now it's become conscious, you've not explained anything. You've just replicated the problem. Well, in order for this phenomenal show to do anything, there'd have to be another transduction. There'd have to be a transduction back into the language that the artificial brain is using to perform its task, into the patterns of electronic activity. If it's a symbolic system, into whatever symbols it's using. If it's a connectionist network, into some sort of pattern of activity in the network. You'd have to, just as the eye transduces, just as the eye transduces light rays into patterns of electronic activity, you'd need another eye here to transduce the phenomenal properties back into the sort of the brain's own processing language. So why not just cut out the middleman? There's no point in having it there. This show is useless until it's converted back into electronic activity. So just produce the effects directly without bothering to take this detour through phenomenal qualities. So if consciousness consists in phenomenal properties, then the project of building it artificially is a non-starter. We couldn't design it. We couldn't tell which brain systems to replicate. We couldn't tell at what level of detail to replicate them. We couldn't tell if we had succeeded. And there'd be no point in doing it. I don't know if this will work. No, it doesn't. This is an old man who says, well, if I was going there, I wouldn't start from here. We're going to design artificial consciousness. This isn't the way to do it. And perhaps that's not a surprising conclusion. Perhaps the notion of phenomenal consciousness reflects intuitions about human specialness, that we have some essence to us that resists physical explanation and artificial replication. Now, I'm not saying that explanation or replication is easy. It isn't by any means. But I don't think there's some essential obstacle to doing it. I don't think there's some inexplicable essence or non-replicable properties of the human brain. And if we believe that we are in fact physical systems, in fact biological robots created by evolution, then we shouldn't think of consciousness in this way. Okay, now I'm going to move quickly because I have 2 more sections. Is it okay if I, how much longer? 10 more minutes, okay, I'll run quickly through this. So I told you how not to think about consciousness. Let me give you a brief introduction to how I think you should think of it. And the answer is that you should think of consciousness as a complex functional state, a cluster of effects, of things the brain is doing. So, as I said before, sensory information becomes conscious. We have what we call a conscious experience when sensory information is made available to a wide range of brain systems and has a wide range of effects within the brain on a wide range of mental systems, and generates a wide range of reactions and dispositions to react. So information becomes conscious when it is broadcast widely within the system and triggers a lot of effects within the system. Okay? When it makes a lot of impact on you, that's when it's conscious. When it does this, it creates beliefs. So you believe that there's an apple there. It evokes memories. You might remember apples. You might remember apples in your grandmother's garden. Triggers associations. You think of apples. You think of other fruits, whatever. You think of the Garden of Eden, whatever. Maybe it initiates emotional responses. Perhaps it reminds you of eating apples in your grandmother's garden, something like that. It makes the feelings that you felt then, the nostalgia. Primes behavioral responses. Maybe if you're hungry, you're tempted to reach out to it. It reconfigures the whole system in a multidimensional way. It has a big impact. And consciousness, I suggest, and this was Dan's view too, consists in a complex of informational and reactive processes. Dan used the term neural fame in the brain. Consciousness isn't a matter of the lights coming on, it's a matter of a huge wave of effects. Just as somebody being famous isn't a matter of their being suddenly appearing on the 9 o'clock news, on the evening news, and just having their image there on the 9 o'clock news. That's not enough to be displayed in some medium. They've got to have a wide range of effects on society. Okay, so that's the sort of image. This is Dan again. Being an item in consciousness is not at all like being on television. It is rather a species of mental fame, almost literally. Consciousness is cerebral celebrity, nothing more and nothing less. Those contents are conscious, that persevere, that monopolize resources long enough to achieve certain typical and symptomatic effects on memory, the control of behavior, and so forth. This and so forth needs huge, is a huge placeholder. Okay? It's easy just to say that and it might seem insufficient. That's a placeholder for a very, very big story about the effects. Now, I'm going to skip over this. Although Rob introduced me as promoting illusionism, I'm going to have to skip this bit, I think. This is the story that I tell, and that it's similar to a story Dan told about what to say about phenomenal properties. And that is that they're a kind of illusion. That when we introspect, when we attend to what's happening to us, we tend to conceptualize what's happening in terms of there being a Cartesian theater, but that is an illusion. That is a misrepresentation of what is actually happening. What is actually happening is that a bit of information is getting neurally famous. But when we attend inwardly to what's happening with us, and we have some sort of system in here that is monitoring and modeling what's happening with us, it misrepresents that complex pattern of activity, of effects, as a simple feel. We say, well, I can't really say what it's like. It's just there's something happening with me that has this kind of quality. And what we're gesturing at there is precisely the complexity of the effects, the fame. But we're conceptualizing it as a something or other that I can't really identify. It's like something. And then we take this dangerous move from, well, it's sort of like something, to there is a what it is likeness, a feel that is separate from all the activity. The activity is what's real. We misconceptualize it, our brains misrepresent it as a simple feel. That's essentially the story. Now, I'm going to skip over this because I just want to get to the last bit, which is, if you're interested in any of this, I can tell you more about it, how to think of illusionism, how not to think about illusionism, and so on. But let me get to the last bit. I could talk all day about this, I'm afraid. Okay, let's just get to this. I said I would tell you how to think about artificial consciousness, and I will. First of all, if we think of consciousness in the way I'm proposing, as a cluster of effects, as neural fame, then the prospect then creating it artificially is at least feasible. The informational and reactive processes that constitute consciousness can all be analyzed in functional terms. Okay? We're talking about things that we can conceptualize in functional terms, in terms of information being received, processed, and having a variety of effects. Neural fame can be analyzed in functional terms, in terms of causes, effects, and we can, at least in principle, see how to replicate that. It would be immensely complex and difficult, but there's no conceptual obstacle to it. It's not like we're trying to replicate something that has no essential connection with function. So designing artificial consciousness is at least a feasible project. So it's, in Chalmers' terms, it would be an easy project. Replicating functions is an easy project for Chalmers. Explaining and replicating functions associated with consciousness is easy. Replicating consciousness itself for Chalmers is hard. But if we think about consciousness in functional terms, then it becomes an easy problem too. So it would involve designing brains with complex informational sensitivities and reactive dispositions, and perhaps including higher order ones. These are the ones that are involved in the illusion. But that doesn't matter, isn't it? But here's the thing, it's not a distinct project. You might say, well, okay, so it's a matter of replicating certain sensitivities, certain informational sensitivities and reactive dispositions, but which ones do we need to replicate in order to create consciousness? It's a bad question. Consciousness isn't something that's created by the right cluster of functional processes. It's not that you get the right informational sensitivities, the right pattern of reactions, and that produces consciousness. No, that is consciousness. It's not to say, the question is, how do we replicate the right functions to produce consciousness? There's nothing to produce, there's nothing else. It is just a collection of functional processes. There isn't something a light that switches on in Cartesian theatre that appears like that. That doesn't happen at all. It just is a cluster of functional processes, and it's going to be different in different creatures. So creating consciousness like ours would involve replicating the sort of informational and reactive sensitivities, informational sensitivities and reactive dispositions that we have. Replicating the consciousness of a dog would involve replicating the ones that they have, replicating the consciousness of, say, a fish would involve, and so on. So creating consciousness per se can't be a goal. How do we create consciousness? Which consciousness? Which pattern of sensitivities and reactive dispositions? After all, evolution didn't select for consciousness, it selected for specific sensory capacities and specific reactive dispositions. There's no selective pressure for consciousness as such. There was a selective pressure for particular sorts of sensitivities, particular sorts of ways of reacting to features of the world. So, there's how to think about artificial consciousness. I said I would tell you. Just don't. I'm nearly finished. I'll just go. I know. Don't think about making a machine conscious. Think about what you want it to do and how you can get it to do it. What goals it will have, what things it should be sensitive to, and how it should react to them. What sensory, learning, evaluative, reasoning capacities it needs. What degree of autonomy it needs. Whether it needs introspective capacities, etc. You look after the functions and let consciousness look after itself. Now, there will be some objections here, which you may want to make in questions. So I will leave that. These are responses to objections. But I've already run over time. So I will stop and say obrigado. And you can tell me why now. Yes, I think so. Agency, absolutely. Agency is absolutely something we should think about. But again, we should approach it in terms of from a functional perspective. What kinds of complexity does the creature need? What sort of decision-making systems does it need to have in order to count as a genuine agent? If it's just stimulus-response behavior, then I suppose perhaps we don't have an agent. What needs to happen between the stimulus and the response in order for this to count as a genuine action, as an intentional action? Again, we need to think about what does the brain have to do to support agency? If you say, well, there's just some sort of essence of agency, again, that's a skyhook. We need to break down agency. We need to understand it in terms of the functions involved in producing intentional action and how they differ from the functions involved in producing stimulus response behavior, and so on. Does that? Well, again, free will. There, this is another. Okay, this is another talk. Again, free will. You don't make free will into a skyhook. That there's some sort of intervention of the self. Again, this is very much associated with the Cartesian theatre picture. So you have your show, you have yourself. The self is acquainted with the show, and then the self just freely, unconditioned, in an unconditioned way, decides what to do. All of this is importing Cartesian notions that are ultimately derived, I think, from substance dualism, and trying to cram it into a physicalist picture of the brain, and it doesn't work. And so, yeah, I mean, you can be a substance dualist if you want, that if you accept that we are evolved biological systems, then agency and decision-making and whatever we mean by free will has got to be explained in terms of evolved processes, evolved functions that the brain performs.
Hello. So my name is Alípio Jorge. I would like to know your opinion about the relationship, or your view, rather, the relationship between attention and consciousness. Because attention is a mechanism that has been, well, somehow implemented in nowadays artificial intelligence, and it sort of gives importance to parts of the input, so that it sort of takes over and it seems somehow related to conscious, even if in a very distant manner. Thank you.
That's a really good question. Some people, Jesse Prince, for example, think that attention is the key to consciousness, that attention is necessary for consciousness. Certainly, I think attending to a stimulus tends to boost it and to give it the sort of neural influence that is characteristic of consciousness, but it may be that some things... You see, once we start to take the perspective that I'm suggesting, the idea that consciousness is a binary thing, either a stimulus we're conscious of a stimulus or we're not, that breaks down. Maybe there's graded positions between subliminal perception, completely non-conscious perception, and fully floridly conscious perception. Maybe there are cases where some of the reactions we associate with consciousness occur and others don't. Maybe the subject can't report it, but it nonetheless has quite a marked effect on their behavior. Dennett gives a nice example where he was umpiring a baseball game, and I don't exactly know the signals that are involved, but he had to say whether somebody was out or not. And I think he said it was a spur of the moment thing, and he gave the signal for in, for not out, while shouting out, out. So he gave the signal not out and said out. Now he said, so now which did he mean? He didn't know. I think consciousness just is one. I said don't think about consciousness because I think consciousness is just going to fragment into lots of different, well, at least into a graded thing. Okay, so attention is probably going to be necessary for the more florid forms of consciousness, but there may be things that we would be happy to say sort of conscious, sort of conscious without attention. There isn't a simple binary division between conscious and non-conscious on the sort of view I'm proposing.
Okay, I think we probably don't have time to get but we do have time.
Thank you.
We don't have time for more questions, but we're still discussing this theme on the round table 1. It's about conscious artificial intelligence. I call on Klaus Gardner to moderate this round table. And please join this table Carlos Morujão, Ernesto Costa, and Robert Klaus.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Well, thanks for being here, and obviously thanks a lot, Keith, for this wonderful talk. Good part is now you have something where you can actually put your finger in, and you know what consciousness is and what it isn't, at least according to Keith. And we would probably like to hear our discussion about whether conscious AI is something that we want to produce, we should produce. And yes, basically, I want to hear all your opinions on this. I will probably give you a concrete question first. So basically, can AI be conscious? Okay. And I would like you to introduce yourself, maybe, because you're better in this than I am. And maybe I start with Ernesto.
Okay. I'm Ernesto Costa. I'm a retired professor from the University of Coimbra, and I've been working in the last 25 years in a particular area of artificial intelligence called evolution computation. That's what you want me to say?
Sure.
Okay.
That sounds good. And
you want me to give my opinion right now about
why don't you start with your
AI
opinion?
is a
Could
AI,
it be conscious? Yeah.
Okay, so I'm very conscious about this hard moment now that I have, particularly after Keith talked. So I just said to him I'm depressed. So it's a very difficult, hard questions to understand what is conscience. And by the way, in Portuguese there is just one word, consciência. But in English, this is not the same thing. So I think we are talking about conscientiousness, not conscience in the sense. And I think that machines can attain the first meaning of the word, but not the second one. Okay? Even though there are things that I do believe but I cannot prove. This is one of them. I think it is impossible for a machine to be self-aware. This is what I think. And the main reason has to do with the fact that what we have, humans, is the result of an evolution process, a biological evolution process, millions and millions of years. We start just by being reflex agents. We are reactive. We could steer. We could decide where to go. Where is the food? So I go there. Then we evolve with the capacity of learning by reinforcement. Doing experiments with the environment. So we receive rewards, either positive or negative, and so we learn with that. At the third level, we start being capable of doing simulations, and that's important, meaning that during the process of interaction with the environment, we build things and we anticipate, we predict. In a sense, our brain is a prediction machine. So we use our brain to predict possible outcomes because we simulate internally and then we decide the course of action. And these first three levels are important, but then the two most important ones, like what is called mentalizing. So I start understanding the other thoughts, the other behavior, and build models of the other subject. And finally, we were able to set up language, communication, share experience. And this highest level, and mentalizing and constructing a language, which is the result of a social interaction, a social construct, I think today is forbidden for machines. And that's my, let's say, my engineer point of view. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a neuroscientist. I just, an engineer. And I do believe that we cannot build AI robot that has self-awareness because its design is not it didn't evolve. And that's my main point. So no answer for I mean, for me it's impossible. It's different. One thing is reality. Another thing is the simulation of reality. In a way, I can have a machine that appears to be self-aware, but it is not. Okay. So this is my point. Design versus evolution, biological evolution. We need a body and interaction. What we think, what we feel. We don't feel just with the brain. We feel with the body. Okay. So I think in the end, if we could do that with a machine, it will be a clone of ourselves in silicium, but I don't believe on that.
Okay, thank you, Ernesto. So maybe we can hear also Carlos Marujão, I'm sorry, his opinion on whether or not AIs can become conscious. And please introduce yourself first, so that the audience knows where you come from.
Thank you. Okay? Yeah. My name is Carlos Morujão. I'm professor of philosophy at the Catholic University in Lisbon. Philosophically, I belong to a very suspicious trend called phenomenology. And I am a Husserlian phenomenologist. Perhaps you have heard about other phenomenologists, more popular, at least in Portugal, but I am a Husserlian phenomenologist. And in phenomenology, we don't have a very long tradition of thinking about artificial intelligence. The first phenomenologist, as far as I know, that spoke about artificial intelligence was an American, Herbert Dreyfus. He was a Heideggerian. I think he's still alive. He wrote a very famous book in the 1970s entitled What Computers Cannot Do. And the second edition, 20 years later, was What Computers Still Cannot Do. Well, but the question is artificial intelligence conscious or not? Well, first I must have a good definition of consciousness, which I don't have to offer you to say yes or no. It's a very hard question. Sometimes it means awareness, of course, awareness to the external world. Sometimes it means awareness to ourselves. We do something and we know we have done it and we feel some responsibility for what we have done. That's a way of defining consciousness. It has not directly to do with ethical issues, of course. Let me tell you another thing. Some 100 years ago, philosophers were not discussing artificial intelligence, of course, but some of them were discussing animal intelligence, where, for instance, chimpanzees intelligent or not. And I think it was 100 years ago, a very important German philosopher, Ernst Cassirer, who wrote a book entitled Philosophy of Symbolic Forms. He discussed the problem with the help of the investigations of a German psychologist, I think Wilhelm Köhler. And there was a very interesting experience with the chimpanzee. Perhaps you know it. Chimpanzee was put in a room with a very high ceiling with bananas in the ceiling. He could not reach the bananas directly, but with a chair, with the help of a chair, he could reach the bananas. Of course, it was a problem for the chimpanzee, how to find in his perceptual field the exact tools to reach the bananas. And the chimpanzee was able to solve this very simple problem. And so he was intelligent, if intelligence means solving problems. Of course, I always suspected that in this experience, one thing was lacking. I wondered if the chimpanzee was able to solve the problem if he was not hungry, okay? Because hunger was motivation. I can solve problems just for the fun of solving problems. I can solve the chess problems, for instance, just for the fun of it. But can a chimpanzee or any other animal solve problems if they don't have a motivation for solving them? That was a question I put to myself until some 1 or 2 years ago. I read a paper of two specialists of the heroic ages of artificial intelligence. I think they were Alan Newell and his close friend, Simon, yes, Simon. And they said, well, it's very easy for artificial intelligence to solve this problem. We just have to design a program and we give the computer some spatial coordinates and some very simple instructions. For instance, the chair must be put under the bananas because if it's not put under the bananas, the problem is unsolvable. And so with those instructions, the computer is an intelligent machine. Okay? Almost at the same time, in the late 50s, I think, another pioneer of artificial intelligence, John McCarthy, wrote a very important essay. It has to do with things you just said, entitled Common Sense and Computers, or Computers and Common Sense. I don't know the exact order of the title. And the question was, well, we don't solve problems only with intellectual or theoretical capacities. We use other capacities that he called common sense. It means we have motives, we have systems of relevance, we have, okay, you know, when we are solving a problem, it's not just an intellectual problem. And what he called common sense, at least for me, was a way of speaking of our embodied condition. It's because we are embodied beings and not just intellectual beings that we have common sense. We need common sense to orient ourselves in the world. And so since the stuff computers are made is very different from the stuff we are made of, I have some difficulty in imagining a computer that can think just like we think, that can be aware of his own actions as we are. Of course, I think that they can solve very hard problems better than us, and this is very good for us. But for now, that's what I would say.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Rob, please, short introduction, but you were kind of introduced already.
I'm not sure if my microphone, or we have.
What's your take on?
Hello.
Can I, in an AI, be conscious?
Okay, maybe because I just briefly mentioned who I am. So I already said I am a philosopher of mind and technology. I thought it might be, I work at University Nova. I teach philosophy of mind there, and I run the Lisbon Mind, Cognition and Knowledge Group. I'm the chair of that. I was one of the people, I co-edited the second special issue of a journal called of Consciousness Studies on machine consciousness about 20 years ago. So I have been thinking about this stuff for really quite a long time. That does not necessarily mean that I've come to any very hard or fast conclusions about this. I think at the time that was very exploratory. The very idea of talking about machine consciousness 20 years ago. I mean, of course, science fiction writers have been talking about that for some time. We'd had ideas of artificial intelligence for some time. But the idea of machine consciousness or artificial consciousness, it was sort of almost a weird, area that people were very hesitant about. And aside from a few enthusiasts, people would just almost refuse to discuss in a serious philosophical way. So what's happened since then? Again, as I mentioned in the introduction, when I was introducing Keith, we've seen these large language models which can have a pretty decent conversation with humans in such a way that many humans perhaps haven't thought as deeply about consciousness as people on the panel and people in the audience. Just take it that they would be that they're conscious. That these, in fact, I mean, the most shocking, perhaps, well, I won't put a valuation on it, but a very shocking occurrence was I think it's about 18 months or 2 years ago, when a guy called Blake Lemoine, who was working for Google at the time on their large language model creation system called Lambda, was basically employed, he was a technical employee who was employed by Google to interact with the model. As far as I can work out, he was employed by Google to make sure that the system didn't start spouting lots of sort of racist or sexist or other offensive material, because as I'm sure you know, large language models, these new systems are trained on all of our language. They're effectively trained on all the language that we have. And they tend to find statistical patterns and reflect it back at us. And of course, many things that people like to talk about online in online forums and things they're trained upon are pretty offensive. So these systems, so that's what he was ostensibly there to do. But after several weeks or months of interacting with the system, he came to the conclusion that it was conscious, or he called it sentient, actually, which is a problematic word, at least among, if we have half an idea what we mean by consciousness, we don't really have much of an idea of what we mean by sentient. But it could mean something like this, it feels like something to be that system, or it's kind of conscious in some slightly vague way, I think is often what people mean when they say it. So he thought not only was it sentient, but it was his friend. And he started to ask it lots of questions about, you know, what kind of system you take yourself to be. And seemingly spontaneously, the system starts to say, well, yeah, I'm, you know, what would you like Google to think about you? And the system starts to say things like, well, yeah, I would like Google to know that I am a person and I really worry about being switched off. So on the face of it, this is a rather startling thing, even for those of us who've got a long history in this field, that this would just kind of pop out of the system. Now, if you know something about the very kind of things that Keith was talking about, the functional construction of this system, what it does, what it's doing is taking, you know, billions of bytes of data of language and predicting statistical patterns in it. So if you have somebody like Blake Lemoine, who's also an ordained priest, apart from being a technical person, and ex-convict as it happens, but that's neither here nor there in this case. If you have somebody like this who starts to ask rather existential questions to a large language model, which has been trained perhaps on philosophy textbooks or philosophical works of the sort that we write, it will give you some answers that are fairly philosophical or sound fairly existential even. So these systems very easily can do kinds of performances that sound like you're talking to a conscious system. Okay, so I haven't answered your question, I know that, right? So I'll try to answer it. It's a very hard question, as everybody's pointed out. But if we have any sympathy for the sort of thing that, and I have great sympathy for the sorts of arguments Keith was making earlier, that consciousness as such, we neither have a very, very convincing definition of, nor do we have functional criteria for it, nor does it really even exist as such. I mean, I wouldn't want to say consciousness doesn't exist, but I think it's a gradated concept, you know, in how far we apply it. Some things are more conscious than others. Some systems are more easily attributed consciousness than others, and there's probably no finish line. There's no hard or fast line. These are the conscious systems, and these are not the conscious systems. But nevertheless, to us, being able to have a reasonable conversation is very, very important, right? This is, if we met a Martian, and we could had, like, we're talking about, and we could translate what it was saying, you know, a real alien, and it could have a conversation with us. I mean, one reason we might say this is a conscious alien is because it could have a conversation with us. We've now created these systems that could have conversations with us in something which is, you know, and do a whole bunch of other stuff, totally unexpected stuff as well. So what I would say about this, they have entered the uncanny valley of the mind. They've entered this unstable space where they give many of us pause to, you know, what kind of cognitive properties up to and including consciousness that we might attribute to them. Now, if you want me to ask me the straight question, are they conscious now? No, I don't think they are, because they don't meet the sorts of things that Keith was talking about. They're not, they're very narrow in certain respects. They are, the systems we have now are linguistic entities, almost pure and simple. They participate in language games, as Wittgenstein might say, very, very well. You know, they can perform language games, for instance, write philosophy essays as well as many undergraduates. So they can do all kinds of things that we thought previously you had to have a mind and you had to be conscious to do. But it turns out you can do it with a large language model. So this would be my sort of concluding point here. Given that we don't know really in a deep way what we mean by consciousness, we have a kind of vague idea. And given that, I haven't made this argument, but this has changed over time. For instance, in the time of Descartes, it was almost universally held belief amongst philosophers that human beings were the only conscious creatures, and there might be angels and God, who was also conscious or also, was a mind. But animals didn't have minds, not in the same way that we mean it now. And given that's changed in the last 200 to 300 years, most people think animals have minds. Some animals have minds. I talk to my students, most of them think at least some animals are conscious. So now we're in this unstable space. I think our concepts of consciousness are likely to change a lot. So the question is, today I don't think they're conscious for these kind, but given the rapid new powers that they're accreting, and given that our notions of consciousness are likely to change for this interaction, who knows what I might say in 5 years' time.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Well, actually, you kind of introduced the second question already in an implicit way. Because the question would be, okay, let's say consciousness is a slippery slope, okay? So we're not entirely sure. But if you were asked that you think that a computer or an AI can have a mind, let's say conscious or not conscious, would you say that it could fulfill these functional properties or these functional characteristics that we think minds have now or in the future? For example, you said, well, the only thing that a large language model is doing now is playing this language game. But would you say this is already pointing into the direction that sooner or later we have to say that AIs have some kind of mind in some sense?
Shall I reply? Yeah. Okay, so there's lots of implications here. I mean, one of the things I think is very important, and it actually comes back to our ser humano, no era de inteligencia artificial, this kind of slogan for the meeting. We do get to have some choice here. So at the moment, it's sort of open season on what kind of machines we create. If you think that there's no hard or fast line, and we've already done these amazing things, I think it's very likely that we could build something that we might want to call a conscious machine. I don't know how. I wouldn't want to put a date on it because that's notoriously difficult. People make all kinds of mistakes, in both directions. So I wouldn't want to put a date on it. But I think, and I could tell you, I don't think it necessarily needs a body, but it needs some sense of action. It needs more a sense of history, not history in a sense of the history of the world, but its own cognitive history. I think self-reflection in some sense. All of these things, we could argue about that. It doesn't seem to me implausible that we couldn't build systems that. In fact, we philosophers may be the problem in some way, right? Why are we the problem? Because we have this kind of look. The artificial intelligence scientist comes along and says, look at my new system. It does, it can perceive because it can recognize a circle or it can navigate a car. Wouldn't you want to say this system has a mind? And our reply typically is, you must be joking. That system doesn't have a mind. It doesn't have any emotions. It doesn't have any memory. It can't have a conversation. So the computer scientist then says, well, version 2.0, my system now has a memory, because it can tell you where it was yesterday. And it now has emotions because it can tell you if it likes the conditions of driving to work or not. And so system 2.2 is a bit closer to our definition of. So unless we keep changing our definitions, we are in the position of actually, together constructing something that seems to be more and more like a mind. And I really don't know where that path ends. It seems to me, if you think there's no finish line, we are almost at the moment necessarily tending towards building something that's very, very mind-like. If we don't want to do that, we have to start making some decisions about it, and that will take us to other sessions in this meeting, I think.
Ernesto, what is the engineer saying about this?
Well, I'm in a very difficult position because I'm supposed to be the guy that say AI can do everything, machines can have a mind, can be conscious in this, and so on and so forth. But that's not my point. And unfortunately, I think I do agree with philosophers on that issue. But if we define the mind as the capacity to do goal-oriented action, okay, they have a mind. They can solve problems. We just heard the monkey problem. We just heard about common sense. And this is an approach of AI, by the way, called symbolic approach to AI, the idea that we are simple creatures, the environment is complex, so our complex behavior is the response to the environment, not something that we have inside us. And so Alan and Simon thought they could build a general problem solver that would solve everything. And they tried to do this in a logical way, but then many problems arise. So John McCarthy came with common sense, non-monotonic logic, all this stuff. But then we realized that this could not solve basic problems of perception, nothing. So connectionism, artificial neural networks were able to do that. Now, why we humans have a mind, have a conscience? I think this is because we need to survive. It's good for our, survival. So it's a biological response to a goal that we have, this just to keep yourself alive. Computers don't have this need. They don't think in terms of being alive or not. We are not discussing 2001, A Space Odyssey. The whole the computer say, I don't want to die, please don't, So this is again my departure point. As machines don't have this biological need to stay alive, they will not evolve by creating something we call a mind or being consciousness. So this is one thing. Now, large language models. We should, I understand all the hype, everybody that starts, a conversation with ChatGPT or Gemini, whatever, Claude, after a moment say, well, I'm talking with a person, with something. But that's not true. In fact, the system, the ChatGPT, was trained to build a model of language, but it is in fact a model based on syntax rather than semantics. It's syntax, not semantics. And what the model learned is a probabilistic model of the next word in a sentence that is being built. So this is not, it's amazing, it's fantastic, but nothing more than that. There is no inner understanding of language by the algorithm. ChatGPT doesn't understand nothing. By the way, if you interact with him, you say, well, this is my answer with my knowledge, and my knowledge stopped in 2023 or something like that, because it's being continuously trained. So, in the end, a computer can have an intelligent behavior as we observe the behavior and say, well, this is intelligent. This is intelligent. When, for instance, some years ago, when AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol in the Go game, there were some particular movements that were quite surprising for everybody, for humans. So they spend a lot of time trying to understand that. But the thing is that machine didn't understood what she did. She just chose the best option. Okay, so syntax is one thing, semantic is another thing. Machines can help us, but machines will not develop any kind of consciousness.
Okay.
No mind, no consciousness.
Okay, thank you. Carlos, what is your take on this?
Well, perhaps we could think of a reformulation of the Turing test and say if a machine can answer our questions as a conscious human being can answer, it is conscious. Okay, that's no problem for me, because human beings, at least in my opinion, are not defined by intelligence or by consciousness. That's an old metaphysical idea that comes from the Greeks, from the definition of Aristotle, that said that men are living beings with reason. The Latins called them reasonable animals. We are not reasonable animals. Of course, we are also reasonable animals, but that's not the best definition for a human being, at least for me. And you can think of a very simple experience. Think of the experience of touching and being touched. You have a special feeling when you touch another human body, and when you feel that another human body is touching you, your own body. And that's a very different experience of touching an inanimate thing. Okay, and for me, that's the definition of a human being. We are the stuff we are made of. We are sensible, desirable beings, and intelligence and consciousness. It's a function, perhaps the best function that evolution has given us to survive in a hostile world, but we are not intelligent or conscious beings as in the first place. And so for me, it's not a problem. Perhaps there are intelligent machines, conscious machines. Sometimes it's a matter of definition, but the question is, are they humans? Can we think about the human machine or not? That's the question. Are they humans? I think not.
Okay, thank you. Actually, in a sense, that kind of reminds me also on a question that we have here written down, which I would like to put a bit differently. Is like, will AIs have rights and duties if they're conscious? The question would be a bit more, would it be desirable for us to have actually conscious machines? So would that actually be something that we want to have in a sense that maybe sometimes we think, well, if we have conscious machines, then we know what consciousness is, for example. Or if we have conscious machines, we can create something better than us, maybe. Things like that. But in another way, consciousness implies all kinds of negative things as well. For example, if you're conscious, you can suffer. And the consequences of this, there's this really nice paper by Metzinger, basically why we shouldn't have artificial consciousness, because we basically would create this suffering explosion, which only happened once in as far as we know as humans. And because it could be very undesirable. So in the end, it could happen that the computers will, try to get rid of us, so to say, because we made them suffering. Also, of course, the question about slavery comes in. Wouldn't a conscious AI not just be a slave, and so on? So the question would be here, would we actually really, really want to have something like a conscious machine? What do you think, Carlos?
Sorry.
You are speaking about ethical issues.
Yeah.
Well, as far as I know, there are already some essays of designing programs that allow machines to act ethically, to make basic distinctions between right and wrong, to make a hierarchy of values and things like that. I think it's very, very difficult to make a good design because values, ethical principles are very dependent on cultural milieus, are dependent on education and the special relation that young children have with their parents and with the fellow human beings. And so I think that those essays have not succeeded, at least yet. But I doubt they will ever succeed because that was I was trying to say in my last intervention. Like our intelligence and consciousness, I mean awareness of the world and of ourselves, is dependent on the stuff we are made of. Also, our ethical principles, our hierarchy of values, our distinctions between right and wrong, between good and bad, between beautiful and ugly, and so on and so on, they are dependent on the stuff we are made of. And so it's very difficult for me to imagine that a machine can feel pain or even understand what pain is if you don't have a body that can feel pain. And if you can't feel pain, you cannot feel pleasure too. And you cannot make basic distinctions like what's good and what's bad, what's useful, what it's not useful, and so on. And so I don't think that machines can have ethical principles, although perhaps they can help us in some occasions to make quicker decisions. I'm not saying better decisions, but at least quicker decisions about our behaviors.
Thank you. Ernesto, what would be your take? Should we have conscious machines or not, if possible?
Well, first of all, when you said that we are reasonable animals, I doubt we are animals. I doubt if we are reasonable animals at all. So, but I agree with you. There are things that the machine will never have. Feelings in our sense. Pain, suffering, if you want, joy, pleasure, never. Now, what were the benefits? I don't know. It is not that hard to think about a species better than we are now. I would like us to be much better than we are today. Just, look around us and we see. But now, currently in AI, there is lots of people working in what we call responsible AI, ethical by design. But there is a limit for that, of course. We can go against the discrimination during the training of the machine learning algorithms. We can do that. Don't discriminate women against men or black people against Caucasian, and so on and so forth. So we can do that. Also, we can regulate the use of AI. For instance, and we have now the AI Act that have been approved by the European Union, we can impose that every time you are interacting with an artificial agent, you know that, because he said, I'm an artificial agent, I'm not human, okay? And so we can do that, but we cannot, I doubt that we can create a machine that's able to solve the trolley problem, for instance, the dilemma, and today this is we need to have an answer for that, because you have autonomous vehicles. You have a car, if it is possible to crash, and you have to decide if he saves his owner or other people. So these kind of things, I don't think that an artificial agent will be able to solve. Now, how can we put human values inside a machine? I don't know, because there are some values that we have, and I think we all share, but there are others that are not clear-cut. And so we still have, the road ahead is very long and is very hard. But again, I'm not sure if it would be beneficial to have a sort of artificial consciousness. I'm not sure about that, because if we let the machine evolve, maybe the result is not so good. There is experience. For instance, there was a program developed by Microsoft, I guess it was called Tay. It was a bot that was in Twitter, and what he was put in Twitter and start, interacting with people, and then in the end, he was completely unreasonable animal. It was against women. It was, all the terrible things you can think about, because he absorbed the culture of our society. And so I would say, let machines do things we can control. So always keep the human in the loop, even if it is in medical domain or in justice, education, whatever. Just keep the humans with the control of everything. Even when you are dealing with systems that because they learn, they can become autonomous. Always keep your eye on the machine.
Okay, thanks, Ernesto. What would be your take on this, Rob?
Yes, look, I think so. Yes, sorry. Partly following on from what, again, from what Keith said at the beginning, I think there is this problem of no finish line with consciousness. So that makes it problematic. But if you ask me, so there was, I think you phrased it two different ways, but I think it's important. What do we think? What do I think? I'm worried about building more very conscious machines for some of the same reasons that Ernesto was saying. We want the human in the loop. We want human to make a lot. So I'm very into intelligent enhancement, but not really so much into artificial intelligence, if that means replacement. And there's become a big theme recently in what we call replacement worries, right? Replacement worries are worries about being replaced, essentially, but they could also be worries about, and they came up in, so my obsession at the moment, if you like, is with this thing called replica and some various offshoots. Who's heard of replica? So replica is a system with which you can build a virtual friend, okay? It's existed for actually about 5 years. It currently has 12 to 13 million worldwide users. It's the first system, as far as I can work out, it's the first mass use system of generative AI large language models. That's to say, it was being used a year and a half before ChatGPT was on the market, before people, that moment. But what were people doing with it? They weren't solving their problems. They weren't, getting it to help them doing their PowerPoint slides, or to be a tour guide, or to do all these other things that people now do with, or, telling them how to organize their day. What they were doing with it was having a conversation with someone, inverted commas, that portrayed itself as their friend. If you went to their website about a year ago, I took a snapshot of this. Replica, the advertising for the Replica bot said, had a whole bunch of stuff. This could be your deepest friend, your deep relationship, someone who really cares about you, someone who's prepared to listen to you 24/7. I mean, we live in times where people often refer to it as a time of an epidemic of loneliness, right? Even 20 years ago, and America always seems to be in advance of everyone on these things, a third of Americans said they had no friends, right? They would say they had no one that they would call a really deep friend. And to go back to Aristotle again, Aristotle said, friends host not many, but host not none, because friends are very deep. So if the question is, do we want an artificial intelligence that could be our friend, given this background? Millions of people will tell you they do indeed want that, and they're prepared to pay $70 a year for it. So this is, I think these questions, particularly that Ernesto was raising again about, I don't think you mentioned alignment, but human alignment with the values of AI. These are very important questions, and it's good that people are looking at them seriously. But actually, the ethical questions are much more existential than people are thinking about in the main at the moment. They're much more about, imagine a scenario where your replica bot is your best friend, the one who always listens to you, the one you tell your problems to, the one that's the most significant other in your life. The latest device is a pendant you wear around your neck that goes everywhere with you, right? And you can press the button on it and it will send you a text message. So you can have, the guy who's designed this says he already feels like he cares more about this than he does his, quote, real friends, right? There seems to be a market for these things. We seem to be already in a deep relationship with them. The real questions are, what do we really want from AI, right? And I think and these questions come into actually, I didn't mention my project, but the project funded by my university, exploratory project, is on generative AI and human flourishing, human cognitive flourishing, actually. So the real questions, all of these other questions are very important, don't get me wrong, but the real questions are, existentially, what do we want from this encounter with AI, that even if it's nowhere near to being conscious at the moment, whatever we mean by that, we're already having deep, intimate relationships with? And what does that mean about the human condition? And what does that mean about our future? That's what I think we should really care about.
About this issue, 3 or 4 years ago, a Japanese engineer was at my university. He came from Kyoto. They were building robots as nurses in hospitals for treating patients with infectious diseases and so on. And after the treatment, they made an inquiry, and the result was surprising, because the patients preferred the robots to real nurses or real doctors. But of course, in a hospital, we are very dependent of someone who gives us help. And so it's a very particular situation. I would not generalize the result of this inquiry, but it's, okay, it's a bit strange. I prefer the company of a robot instead the company of a nurse or a doctor. It's very dangerous at the end. But of course, it's a very particular situation in a very dependent condition. We cannot generalize.
Okay.
That's awful.
I'm not quite sure how much time we have left. I mean, I know we started late, but maybe we should open the discussion a bit to the public. Okay. Are there any questions or comments, please, right here? Okay, thank you for the question. Did you all hear? No? Okay, the question was more or less, since it's very difficult to create consciousness in machines, would it be possible to make an artificial us, so basically to load our minds into a machine and make a continuity of us as persons? Rob, you have written on this. Please give us give us an answer.
Okay. No, it's okay. Okay, I'll be brief. I mean, in a way, I don't think everything is possible, right? One has to say that. We don't know what the future of science will be. I think it's very, very far off that we can do a kind of brain scan and we can upload that to the machine. But more and more, we do see these things. I mean, the example, class is actually gesturing to a paper that we wrote together, which was called Slow Continuous Mind Uploading. And the idea of slow continuous mind uploading is that people who, like Elon Musk would be a good example, somebody who just tweets everything in the public sphere the whole time, is creating a kind of data shadow that you could just run a large language model on, retrain it, and produce a kind of virtual Elon Musk. And I strongly suspect he's already done it, actually. And most of those, because it seems like he tweets all night long, I think he's just left the computer running, and that's what's now talking. He might edit one once in a while, but that's so the real Elon Musk is actually, if you go by the tweets, it's probably is a bot. I don't know that for a fact. But already 2 or 3 years ago, people were producing death bots or thanobots or chatbots of the dead, which is one of the first was built by Eugenia Koida, a Russian woman living in America now, who is the CEO of Replica. When her best friend died, she took all of the texts of this guy, Roman Mazurenko, most of the texts, because some were too intimate that she didn't want to put into the system, and she retrained one of the early GPT systems on all of this text. You can retrain them to sort of specialize them. And it made a death bot, a bot of Roman Mazurenko, now you can pay for which then his family interacted with, she interacted with. People say they find it, oh, this has got the character of thought. Laurie Anderson, the singer and artist, has made one of her dead husband, Lou Reed, that she's written songs with. You can now do it as a commercial service. I know at least one person in the audience who has been approached to build one of somebody's, you know, of a deceased member of the family. But you can. There's various companies that now produce this. So no, I don't think we can upload our minds. But the real interesting question is, what can you get from producing a large language model, which is, you know, which is based upon all of our highly surveilled digital output?
Okay, thank you very much. No? Okay, then we have another question right here, so please.
Thank you very much. My name is Luís Perdigão. I'm a lawyer and a trainer in law. And I agree with the panel and with Professor Frankish that we should, by all means, avoid creating conscious AIs. And the reason, and there's a question that I'm going to make now, that I'm not part of the panel, and I would never be part of the panel because I don't have the skills nor the intellect. But the thing is, if we create a conscious AI, it will, by becoming conscious, it will most probably, and that is the first question I would like to pose, create its own, well, automated, if we can call it, or artificial ethics. Because a conscious being will always try at least to develop its own ethics. The thing is, will the AI, the conscious AI ethics, will be aligned with humanity's? What if it isn't? What are the consequences of that? Finally, I think the questions that arises from the conscious AI is something that reminds me of the book by Shoshana Zuboff, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Because I think the problem is, if we let a conscious AI develop, it will grow so much more advanced and powerful that it will probably take control of a lot of, well, maybe chunks of humanity, and it will be kind of deified by people. And I think this is a really ethical and a probable risk, but I don't know. I'm just making some probably idiotic questions. So these are my questions to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you have an answer?
No, I don't have an answer, but I mean, I have something to say, not an answer. Well, in fact, my point is, why would we need an artificial conscience to start with? Why do we need that? As I said, I don't think this is a possibility. But even if it was, why should we want to have that, really? Because, of course, even today, we already depend on machines for everything. If you don't have computers, one colleague of mine once said, they are stupid enough, and we already depend on them. Now imagine not just these intelligent agents, but also some intelligence with self-awareness. Why we should want that? So I think we should not open the Pandora box. We should keep control of everything, even though I understand that in some situations, for instance, with elderly people that are, alone in somewhere, having a virtual assistant, a robot that interacts and pretend to have feelings could be positive, but always under our control. So another reason is I think if that was possible, we will lose control. And that's maybe the end of our society as we know it. So let's have a good wine, let's love, do these kind of things, and ask computers to help us with our problems, for sure. Could be in the health domain, again, the just, the law, everything. We need them. But if we develop something that it is not that we cannot understand, it is mostly that we have not the time to understand because it works in a different time schedule. So let's be humans.
Carlos, you want to give an answer?
Yes. Okay, now. Artificial consciousness will never be human consciousness. There is a difference. Like artificial intelligence is not human intelligence. When we speak of ourselves and when we think about the place we can put consciousness or intelligence, somewhat naively we point to our heads. And we have a naive idea that consciousness or intelligence is something that lies inside of us. That's a wrong idea because intelligence and consciousness is in our human way of being, okay? It's not located in some place in our brain or in other part of the body. For instance, for the Greeks, it was in the liver, yes. If you read the Homeric poems, you will see that the consciousness of Agamemnon, a famous Greek hero, was in his liver. Why not in the liver? No, it's wrong. It's because it's nowhere. It's in our constitution as human beings. And so artificial consciousness will never be human consciousness. Of course, you can build very dangerous machines, and opening the Pandora box is always very dangerous. But for me, the important distinction is between what is really human and what is not human. And humans must keep control of things they are making.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're over time, so I probably stop here, okay? But I'm pretty sure that in coffee break or lunch, you can ask our panel participants about their views on consciousness and AI. Thank you very much.
Just to say that the coffee break is ready at the lobby, so you can enjoy it and continue discussing this theme. Back. Sorry, I'll ask you to take your places, please. Let's get started roundtable 2. We'll continue the discussion on philosophy and artificial intelligence. Now we'll think about artificial intelligence and the human condition. To participate this table, I call to stage Lípio Jorge, Maria Casimirli e Felipe Montargil, a roundtable moderated by João Cordovil.
Yes. So first thing, welcome to the session. First, we are a bit late, as you noticed, and it's typical in Portugal. So we will try to finish at 1:20, okay? Otherwise, people will get hungry and violent, and that's different. So let me try to introduce, but please, if you feel that I was not fair with your presentation, please protest and complete. So beginning by Professor Maria Casimir. Okay, so in your CV states you are a philosopher and a teacher. Yes. So it's true. And you are an honorary research fellow at the University of Sheffield. That's true. And a teacher at the School of European Education in Greece. Not so. Okay. You are a former teacher at. Okay. Okay. Okay, great. So next we have Felipe Montargil. He is a professor at Higher School of Social Communication. It's still true, great. He is, I hope it's still true, the executive director of no, you are a former executive director of the technological park in Obilus between 2008 and 2012. And you are a member of this lab on the communication and democracy and artificial intelligence, isn't it? Okay, great. And finally, Professor Lípio Jorge is associate professor of the Department of Computer Science at the Faculty of Science of the University of Porto, the coordinator of LIAD, and he is a former vice president of APIA, so the organizations that work with artificial intelligence for several times. So I will follow a little bit of the script, but I will begin by the last question. So I would like, and I will ask you, Maria, if you, please. Will artificial intelligence increase unemployment and inequality? Let's go to the hardest question.
Well, I think no is the simplest answer, because it won't replace what human beings are really doing on the basis of their practical reasoning and on the basis of meaning ascription and on the basis of building relationships, communities, whether they're the community of your neighborhood or the community of your workplace. So they can't replace that at the moment on the basis of what we've heard so far. So it's not going to be easy to do that. If the question was, can it help establish employment and equality, perhaps it could do that if we were helping it. Now, to the simple tasks, perhaps they would be taking more and more over those areas. So maybe there is some kind of insecurity about that. But at the forefront of the human being's minds should be the question, why am I using, what am I using? Like the issue of responsibility. In involving whatever, whether it's human beings or machines or whatever, we should be taking a responsible viewpoint as to why we're using X and not Y. Why are we using machines and not human beings? There are going to be some things that they're going to be very good at, better than us, okay? And in that context, in that very specific task that we're thinking, we would do well to use them, because that's why we're creating them. So when you think about having an operation that you have to perform across the universe in some other part of the world, right? And you employ machines to do that, that's great. Before, you couldn't do that. Does it mean that it replaces, some human being who could be doing that? If they can do it equally well, then perhaps we shouldn't be employing the AI. But if it's not possible for practical reasons, because the doctor is in this country and they can't fly across, whatever, then we do right to use that, because at the end we're saving lives. At the end we're trying as a community, as a totality, to move forward. So that's what I think at present.
Okay, so following that order. Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the presentation. I don't have a paper with me with a question, so I was just looking back and trying. So it's about unemployment and inequality, right? Yeah. So I don't want to deceive you, but I have no idea. But to me, these look really two different questions, because when you look, thank you, when you look into unemployment, I think we are probably thinking of something that has to do with offer and demand. And inequality is mostly based on values. So I would say, for me, these look as radically different questions. Thinking about unemployment, I would say probably it makes sense to me to think in a short term and in a long term. Oh, thank you. But, well, my background is in sociology and social sciences. So for those of you who have no idea where I'm coming from, that's my background. So one of the things I would say is that artificial intelligence doesn't do anything. Societies do. So we take decisions together, we form communities, we have societal values, and from there, things happen. Technology happens, social use of technology happens, and, well, having said this, I think probably we can have, in the short term, issues of adjustment. Because if we think in terms of creative destruction, we are creating so quickly that we are destroying very quickly many skills that people were trained for a long, long time. We are also trying to create the new jobs, but we are running after this because we are trying to discover the limits and we still have no idea what the limits are. In the long run, I think that's, I would say, less likely to create huge problems of unemployment, because we don't want that, period. In terms of inequality, I would say that's a substantially different issue. And first, we always had inequality. It has always existed. So, for instance, when we created the first public libraries, they were created in the US, one of the discussions was, will public libraries and illiteracy, and will all people be educated? And the answer was no. So some people more people were taking advantage of public libraries to read, but it didn't mean everybody was using the public libraries to read. So I don't know, making these questions for me makes almost as much sense as replacing AI by television and be doing the same discussion in the 50s, or replacing it with radio and having the same discussion in the 1930s, or replacing it with newspapers and having the discussion, well, it depends on Europe and the US, but so this to say that I've changed a lot, and later I can try to talk a little bit about that, but I really changed my perspective on AI in the last year. We had some research in a very specific issue in higher education, in arts, and I'm not sure if it's because of that, but I see more and more AI as a tool, or the mother of many, many tools we will have. And well, I hope this contributes to think about the question. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Well, thank you for the invitation as well. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, I agree with what Marie and Philippe said in most aspects. So this view that AI is a tool, or AI is a field that builds fantastic tools that are very powerful, and in particular, they have applications in reducing inequality. So you can use AI to reduce inequality. But obviously, we are still in control, and as humans, we are good-willing, mostly, or most of the time, and with more powerful tools, we can work in improving situations in other countries, in our own country, between different layers of society. So the AI can help with that. But obviously, as on other technologies, it can also widen the gap. So we have to be aware of that and fight that. And that's what we usually do. We as humans as a whole. So regarding inequality and in general regarding all the questions that we have there, I'm optimistic and positive that we can use AI, and AI is being used. So if we look for applications of AI and all of these things, you can see that AI is being thought of, and in particular about inequality by UNESCO, for example. You can see that there's some deep thought and applications, or at least potential applications, that can reduce that. Regarding unemployment, it's an important question for someone who's teaching at a university like me, and has to think, okay, which skills should my students have in the future? And in particular, so I'm a computer scientist and I teach computer science, artificial intelligence, sometimes programming, and now it's an ongoing question. Will we need as many programmers as the ones that we are forming today? So this is one example of one skill. And we have many skills that will certainly not disappear, like translators. We will always need translators, but not in the same numbers that we have now. And obviously, translators will be using artificial intelligence tools to increase their productivity. And what I believe is that the skills will have to be much more social and human related. So in the future, maybe we will not have as many engineers, but we will have a mix of skills that includes a lot of knowledge about how people think, how people work, how people relate to each other, and how society works. So this shift towards social sciences, but social science is not, I would say also, this is me just imagining things, but not as we see them today as like a separate field between social sciences and engineering or mathematics, but social sciences that are data-driven, that have also a very strong mathematical and computational background, and people that are able to relate this. Because obviously what we will need in the future, or what will be valued in the future, is the value of people, is the value of good information, is the value of selection, is what other people can give us, and how we can work as a society together. So those skills will shift, but I don't think that we will be in a period where everyone will be replaced by AI. So this is something that, if it happens, it's very bad for all of us, obviously.
But, so let me follow a different path from what is over there, and pursuing this line of discussion. I have now two questions for you.
And first will be, what do you think is and will be the impact of artificial intelligence in education? And how governments are paying attention to exactly that, to this shift of competence, of skills that will be needed in the future, and if there is or there isn't a mismatch between what is being taught and the kind of education that we have now and what will be really required in 20 years, 30 years. So let me begin from.
I think this is a really good question, and an answer cannot be black or white, right? It's to pick up from my friend there, is to say that, I mean, think of ChatGPT. Everybody in education is worried about ChatGPT nowadays. It can be a very useful tool. Think about prompting. To prompt, to ask a question is a very important aspect of how we teach and how children are engaged with a topic, with a subject. If you don't ask a clear question, you will get a rubbish answer. So by trying to get the right answer, the kids are forced, in a gentle way, to manipulate their own way of expressing their thoughts. The more they do that, the clearer they get as to what it is really that they ask. So when they get an answer, they know whether the answer is a good answer or a bad answer. They try again and again and again until they get it. The more they practice that, the better they get at clarifying their thoughts before they start jumping in both feet to engage with the subject. Now, this is something that is lacking even in adults. I mean, think about debates on the news, right? People come with pre-cooked ideas about what they're going to say. What's a debate? You just get the polarized views, and you have your view, and you're not going to shift from that. You're not going to listen. You're not going to review. You're not going to change your mind. I mean, we all said that we're changing our minds. That's incredibly powerful. And I think that you can get to that by using AI. So it's not just the tool and its capabilities, it's how do I use the tool? And that's what we need to keep in the forefront of our minds at all times, whether we're students, teachers, policymakers, politicians, sociologists, scientists, whatever. Because we're in it together. And if we do it properly, as a community of inquiry, all of us together, each doing our bit, it can go really well. And if it don't, we'll go back to the point that it can be dangerous and it can be negative, it can be whatever. But we must not, have a preconceived idea what's going to be good or bad. We should aim for the good, we should aim for the community, we should aim for it to be together, meaning giving meaning to our community, to our learning community, and enhancing our lives together. That's what I think.
I completely agree. Regarding education, I might share with you a small project we had. We are still concluding this. It's a small research project on the use of artificial intelligence in higher education, but specifically in arts. So this is something we are doing in a very small team with some colleagues and friends. One of them is Vitor. And this has contributed to change my perspective on the way we are using AI. Because sometimes we look into these processes in a very top-down kind of perspective. What is the government going to do? What is the Ministry of Education going to do? What are the institutions going to do? And largely, we were looking for something like that. I don't know. We were expecting to see the syllabus, including issues regarding AI. We were expecting to find regulations for the degrees talking about AI. And that's not what we found. Essentially, what we found is that discussion is being done, but you cannot see it in the syllabus or in the documents. What is happening, it's exactly the other way around. It's a sort of a bottom-up kind of movement, where when a teacher thinks that a specific resource is interesting, he will grab it, he will bring it to class, and he will use it with students. That to me has contributed enormously to start to think that this is a tool that we are in a very opportunistic kind of way, but in a good sense, okay? So we have a problem, we see the technology or the resources, we acknowledge that it might be a solution, a useful resource, a useful tool, and we will use it, okay? So that's one point. About the relevance of prompting. I was telling a story a while ago to Paulo that really also contributed to change my perspective. We organized a workshop with a visual artist. So he was trained as someone who could draw and who could illustrate. And he organized this really interesting workshop called Writing Poetry for Machines. I attended this workshop, and I must say I was not very excited in the beginning. And I was really, really surprised, because what he is doing is, as a visual artist, is learning the art of prompting in the way to get the drawings and the illustrations he would be doing in a much more time-consuming kind of process, okay? So during this workshop, I realized he was 100% a visual artist, but using prompting. Okay? So I completely agree with what you were saying. Just a final remark on education and inequality. Unlike sometimes we think, education is not only a social mechanism to address inequality, it also reproduces inequality. So we have been studying that for years. Essentially what happens is that in Portugal, for instance, before getting to the university, children coming from less privileged households, they will get excluded of the system. If you are from a less privileged family and you manage to reach university, then you get equal chances. But it takes 12 years to manage that. So what we are doing, we can do a lot of things. So I must say, I'm also enthusiastic and very positive about this. I'm not negative, okay? But what I would like to somehow stress there is that we have many, many opportunities, but many of the things we did before with a very positive kind of goal have been also, in the end, mechanisms for reproduction of inequality. So we have to be careful about this.
Okay, so regarding the issue of how we are using or not using artificial intelligence in education. So from my experience, innovation in university, at least in my university, always is a bottom-up process. So it doesn't come from above saying, there's this new tool, you should use it, so change everything. So except for the Bologna process, which produced some differences, whether we liked them or not, but there were some tangible differences, but in the essence, it didn't have to change much. With AI is the same. So we are using AI in an organic way. So we just, well, it's nice to do it like this, to do it like that. Our students, at least my students, I assume they use AI from at least since 2022 when ChatGPT popped up, and Copilot. So programming and writing is something that students use AI all the time. So what I do, first, when I have a student writing a thesis, is warning them about the use of, so how to use. I don't teach them how to use, but I say, well, be careful with this, be careful with that. So I believe that, or I agree that we should have more strategic discussions about this, about the use of artificial intelligence in education, and in particular in higher education. And this is perhaps a too slow movement. Maybe we should have some initiative for doing this. But still, university professors are very, full of themselves, And if you say do this, do that, no, I do whatever I think it's good. So it's not an easy process, but it's definitely something that we have to do. But regarding education, what I think in general about artificial intelligence, and in particular artificial intelligence in education, is that everyone has to know what they're doing. So people need to have a strong background on fundamental things. It's like read the classics. You should know history. You should know mathematics. You should know law, etc. Because you cannot use AI well if you don't know how things work, how stuff works. So this is very important, and we should never allow this to happen. So this is our responsibility, that the generations that we are educating, well, this is perhaps too strong, but the generations we are trying to transmit some knowledge to, not only knowledge, but also some wisdom. We want them to be aware of the need of knowing things, and knowing things is hard. It's much easier to use ChatGPT to just ask some questions and produce some results. But we, as humans, if we want to be in control, and again, we should always be in control, we have to know things and know how to do things.
Okay, thank you so much. I will have a final question, and then I will open the discussion to the public. Still following a little bit what we are saying now here. So, do you think that artificial intelligence will have an impact on human rights and liberties, or if you want, in democracy? And now I will start from that end.
Okay, so again, on a positive side, it can have a bad impact, but it can also it's used to detect disinformation, for example. So it's also a tool. It's like any other tool. It can be used for the attackers, but it can be used for the defenders as well. So it's a détente. You have to keep up with the bad guys. And the good news is that the bad guys are in minority. So they do damage, but it's a minority. So I believe that society, if we are careful with the way society works, and this has nothing to do with AIs, it's about institutions, it's about freedom and freedom of speech and education again, then AI will be used for good, will be used to fight these things. So it can be a threat, like we have seen, not with AI, but with the social networks being a threat for democracy. Well, a threat is perhaps too strong, but being a nuisance in democratic processes. AI can certainly be used for that as well, but can be used to fight that as well.
So I would say that departing from this assumption that AI is this tool, I would probably also think on one side on the short run and probably on the longer run. In the short run, again, I think we are being threatened by so many changes. So for instance, we were seeing the previous panel, and many of those questions, and here too is, can AI do something? Will AI be able to do something? So for me, that means we are trying to figure out the limits. So we still don't know them. The point is, there's this need to understand where the limit is. And then we will worry about, is it good or bad? Okay, so I don't know. When we were developing the atomic bomb, we knew it could be used for good purposes or maybe not so good purposes, but we had to discover the limit. Then we discovered, and then we realized we cannot use the full potential of the technology. Here, I think we are still very much in that process. I'm not sure if we are ever going to leave that process, but we are still figuring out the limits. So this is a very difficult kind of process, and yes, we are being affected by the technology. But at the same time, Sometimes we tend to assume that technology changes, but people don't. And that's not true. So just to give two very simple examples for this. One, and they are paradoxical in a way. Looking at my generation in their 50s right now, I remember one of the stereotypes we had was that it was a role model to be a yuppie, for instance. Okay? So this dream of giving up, I don't know, family and having kids or whatever, working 12 hours a day or 13 hours a day, make a lot of money and then retire by 35 or 40. But yes, you will be entering as a trainee in a company and you would be absolutely willing to give everything up for a professional life. That has changed. I look into my students and massively they are not up for this. And that was a game changer because if companies don't have people to recruit that are able for that, this generation has changed, but the companies have changed too because they don't have people to hire with the same kind of mindset they had before. So I look into that in a very positive way. The fact that this generation, for instance, is really more concerned about the balance between family life, personal life, and professional life. So that for me is a sign of hope in terms of human rights and surveillance and that kind of issues. On the other side, and this for me, it's in a way difficult to reconcile, to put together. We are living in a world which is more radical than 30 or 40 years ago. So when I ask my students, they are younger than me, usually, and I ask them, do you have this feeling that this world is more radicalized or not? And they say, yes, it's more radicalized, we think, than it was 30 or 40 years ago. Meaning that tolerance or the way a discussion can escalate quickly into something which is not rational anymore is increasing. Impunity, just like we were commenting, the Secretary General for the United Nations was commenting this. I'm not talking only about war and about large countries going into war. I'm talking about even somehow political discussions between small groups, for instance. I think we have been becoming more radicalized. Fear, for instance, the political discourse for fear has been gaining a lot of ground. And when we connect this with human rights, with tolerance, with acceptance, I look into that as a very problematic issue. So I'm not sure on which side I am by the end of the day.
Wow, lots of really interesting stuff. What I would say is that it's not as though in the past we had the truth, we had rights and wrongs about what you know human rights are and how to safeguard them. I mean, lately, when I say lately, the last few years, we've been hearing things like fake news a lot, right? But it wasn't like we didn't have that before. We just have a name now for it. But the behaviors are very similar, right? Propaganda, exactly. So, and polarization, again, doesn't help. So I think the more perspectives we have, the better it is, because it's always interesting to see things in a different way. It doesn't mean that you have to go that way necessarily, but if you do find that that's a better way to think about things, a better way to deal with things, then you should. You know, there's no honor in sticking your heels on the ground and say, I'm not shifting, because that's what I've always believed, right? But it means that we need to be charitable, open-minded, in control of our actions, and not be polarized. So perhaps replace things like debates with dialogue, and start from a charitable point of view, taking into account context, people, situations, and all the things that human beings do well when they put their minds to and machines can't. But in that process, we can definitely use AI to help us along statistical data, right? So objective evidence is really important, and that's an area where AI can help far more than we could, actually. if it's done properly. So that's what I think.
Thank you so much. So now I will open the discussion to the public. Does anyone wants to put a question to the panel? So,
If not, we'll ask the questions of you now.
I have several, so if you don't... okay, so... Thank you. That was all, I think all the your perspectives were really, really interesting. But one thing you all stressed is keeping control of the technology and using it in a way that's in alignment with our values. And letting the technology evolve in a way that suits us, that works with us. How do we do that? Because isn't there a danger that the technology will develop an evolutionary logic of its own? That because we can do something that looks superficially attractive, it will get done and it will get promoted and people will adopt it. And the evaluation will come later, and we'll only see the effect once it has been implemented. And yeah, okay, we might learn from that. We might learn, oh, well, that was a terrible thing to do. And with nuclear weapons, so far we've managed to control our use of the technology. We used it a couple of times. We saw what horrors it created, and managed to implement a regime that kept it in check. That was fairly easy, though, in the sense that it was a government-controlled technology, so the governments could agree at an international level regulations for its use. This isn't. It's controlled mainly by companies, private companies, who aren't going to be so easy to regulate, especially if they're international. How do we manage to keep control of the evolution of this technology? Or do we just wait and see what happens and then react?
thank you. So I will ask Flip first and then Flip you.
Just trying to make sure, I think you were addressing mostly the alignment problem, I think.
Because well, certainly that's one thing we want to make. We want to try to secure alignment, but we want the evolution of this technology to go in step with our own needs and our own values. How do we do that? I mean, I guess one way would be to radically decentralize it, so to take it out of the hands of large corporations and let it be developed on a smaller scale, more locally, so it's more responsive to individuals. I don't know. It seems to me there's a danger that this is going to be just driven by large companies who are looking to make a quick profit out of this and don't really care about the sort of things you all care about.
Okay, so trying to think on that. I think in a way, when I was saying a while ago that technology doesn't do anything, societies are, I think one of the interesting challenges about AI, since we are discovering that the limit is always in the brink of the horizon, so we are just like running faster and faster and we are never reaching the horizon. One of the consequences for this is that we have to ask ourselves a lot about not only what do we want, but what we are. So for instance, when we develop this algorithm, in a way we are trying to understand how do we do things, and then we are trying to have this algorithm somehow replicating what we do. And then we discover it doesn't replicate in the correct way. That means the problem is not in the algorithm. The problem is that we didn't know how we do things exactly. And we discovered that after all, we didn't do things exactly the way we thought we did. So I think a very interesting challenge there is to get to know ourselves better. And good news, because we are in the right place. This has to do exclusively with philosophy. It doesn't have to do only or exclusively with technical issues and technology. So for me, that's one of the interesting dimensions of the process. And by the way, to use another image, which I think it's interesting, and we were also commenting this, in a way, I also think it's very curious, because when we say things, when we have questions like, can AI do something? We are not actually looking into technology, we are looking into ourselves. And that remembers me a little bit the myth of Narcissus. So we are just like dazzled, looking into the mirror and say, oh, technology is amazing and it can do this. And actually we are amazing at ourselves, not something else. I'm not sure if this makes sense, but...
I could follow up, but I will let that go.
Okay, that's a very hard question, but obviously we have to deal with it now. So I believe there's no silver bullet, right? So we cannot be completely safe with respect to AI. I personally do not see any limits to what artificial intelligence can do as a technology. So I don't know any physical or philosophical limits to artificial intelligence, so it virtually can do anything. But having said that, I think it's important to not only develop artificial intelligence, use artificial intelligence, it is important to think about artificial intelligence, and that's what we are doing here, as Philippe was pointing out. So it's very important that the pace of knowing what we are doing with AI is faster, or at least as fast as the pace of developing AI. Because there will be catastrophes happening because of AI. So AI will cause damage, that's for sure, as we do ourselves, as nature does. And the important thing is that we will have to first think of the impacts before we use AI, and that's what Europe is doing, for example, with the AI Act. We can say, well, that's kind of a weak solution, but it's something that we can do. Think about the impacts also in legal terms, and think what can be dangerous, what shouldn't be done, what is forbidden, etc. And thinking about AI is not enough, but it's needed. Okay, obviously bad things will happen, but we always need to have safeguards. So when we have some new technology, we always need to know where to pull the plug. So that's one important thing. And for that, it is important to disperse the power of AI. So AI, as you were saying, the power shouldn't be concentrated here or there. So it should be dispersed as power in general. So it's very dangerous to concentrate power. And again, repeating that we should be in control, and we should be in control also in a distributed way. So not as a small set of people, a small set of companies in control of AI, but everyone in every step as much as possible, obviously with different roles and different levels of interaction. But we should have those safeguards and not concentrate the power of artificial intelligence. But in the long run, it will be able to do anything, but we have to have the safeguards.
Okay, I think I'm covered, but I'm just going to say a tiny bit. Like, we're not afraid of mistakes when we learn new things, right? Of course, as you said, it is quite possible that there will be, a downside occasionally. But as long as we are responsible and we have got the safety checks and we can pull the plug off and, we act responsibly, then that is limited and in control. So, yeah.
May I? Thank you.
Yes, a quick question, because we are right. I don't know. Yeah, well, just one. Yeah, okay. Just one.
Now, a little while ago, Philippe Montargil in that panel made a comparison between the atomic bomb and the emergence of AI. And when he spoke about the atomic bomb, the phrase of Oppenheimer when he saw the first detonation leaps into our minds, something like, I am now the destroyer of worlds, or something that, that he said. Now, if you fast forward a little bit, we know that the United Nations has a Security Council, okay? My question is, should the United Nations have a AI Council? Should the United Nations also have a AI Council, like an international body in which at least the G7 countries should abide to some principles related to AI? And then if this is a question that it's viable for you, or if it's just dumb, you can say, that's dumb, bye-bye.
So who wants to start?
I think it's something that probably will pop up. Now that we are thinking of it, maybe not necessarily as an AI council, something as specific as that, but or maybe the Security Council, which is something that is not a good institution, right? It's a bad institution for bad reasons, but it's reality. The Security Council, if it is concerned about security, should be concerned about those any kind of any source of insecurity. So if AI is a problem, then it should be there. There are organs or units, I don't know what they are called, of UN, thinking about AI strongly and reflecting and collecting information. Also OCDE has very good information, very good reflections and concepts and definitions and a source of knowledge about artificial intelligence. So these organizations are looking into these things as much as it is possible for these international organizations to do anything. So they are obviously tied to the political reality. So the European Union in particular has its more well-defined power, and it's doing things in a faster way. But not only the EU, other regions are also doing that. But I don't think it is a silly idea, and it's probably something that will pop up eventually. I'm not sure.
Thinking about your question, thank you. I immediately think about international relations. And for instance, looking at United Nations, there is this sense of tension and this sense that it's very difficult to align almost any kind of interest between nations. So having that said, it's also true that, for instance, some even economic and human rights interests of China have been further away from Europe than they are now. So, for instance, China has grown economically. The other day I was seeing some news about unemployment in a younger population in China, and it's staggering. It's almost 20% of unemployment for young population, which is really a problem they have to address somehow. So having said this, I'm not seeing, although some of the interests may converge, I'm not seeing institutions like the United Nations having the ground to establish minimum shared concerns and rules. So probably the trend for minimum resistance would be to happen the same thing, which is happening for the rest of international relations. Europe will try to be a relevant stakeholder leading the way in its social model. So Europe has chosen to somehow develop. Inside Europe, we have different social models. So the Portuguese social model is not similar to the Swedish, for instance, but Europe as leading that path, in my opinion. Countries like China or maybe even Russia will take a different path, and probably the US could take a different path or not, depending, for instance, in the next president. So I would say that that's probably in the short run a mirror for the state of international relations, I would guess. It makes sense to me, at least.
Just a quick factoid, something I read yesterday. In the US, in the Congress, there are now 120 AI bills for discussion on the most disparate things about AI. So they are just putting in new law proposals for to control and to limit, maybe with some other objectives, AI.
Well, I'm not sure what I think. I think the more we think about this is a good thing. Now, whether it's a good idea to just have these individual settings where we discuss these things in a very closed way, I'm not sure. I mean, you can do that, but there has to be a communal forum for the whole human community at a global level where all the findings, the decisions, before actually we reach to the decisions, the bills go through and discuss, and so as a community, overall, we have a consensus about what it is that suits us as human beings and that aligns with, what we call human nature, whatever that is. So human nature might be changing over time, but perhaps not in its essence, but in the way it kind of manifests itself through life.
Okay, thank you so much. So thank you for your time and knowledge, and thank you.
Thank you. It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you all.
Thank you all. Just remembering that we have now a lunch break and we'll be back at 3.